In this story for you to listen to as you drift towards sleep, we will tell you the complete and unabridged history of one of the most feared and fascinating figures in all of history, Tamerlane. This is his story from beginning to end. The world of the mid-14th century was a broken one. The great engine that had driven the previous century, the Mongol Empire, had finally shuddered to a halt. The dream of Genghis Khan, a single dominion stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, was dead. In its place was a graveyard of empires. In Persia, the domain of the Ilkhans had collapsed into a chaotic patchwork of warring city-states. In the north, the once mighty Golden Horde was fracturing from within, its princes tearing each other apart for scraps of power. And in the farthest east, in China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty had been overthrown by a native rebellion, forever expelling them from the lands they had ruled for a century. The Pax Mongolica, the famed Mongol peace that had made the Silk Road safe for merchants like Marco Polo, was a distant memory. Now the roads were ruled by bandits, and the only law was the sword. This political collapse was made infinitely worse by a catastrophe of nature. The shadow of the Black Death still lingered over the world. The plague had swept across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, killing with an apocalyptic fury. It's estimated that it wiped out between 30 and 60% of the population in the lands it touched. It did not distinguish between rich and poor, king and peasant. It hollowed out cities, depopulated countrysides, and left behind a world gripped by fear, paranoia, and a profound sense of instability. Dynasties weakened, economies shattered, and the very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling. It was a world bleeding from 1,000 cuts, a world where life was cheap and brutal. In such times, people do not pray for peace. Peace seems like an impossible dream. Instead, they pray for order. They pray for a hand strong enough to crush the bandits, to discipline the petty warlords, and to forge a single predictable authority out of the chaos. They pray for a ruler who can make the roads safe again, who can punish the corrupt, and who can create a world where a farmer can plant his crops without fear that a passing army will burn his fields. And often, when the world prays for such a figure, it does not get a gentle philosopher king. It gets a tyrant. It gets a conqueror. Nowhere was this chaos more concentrated, this yearning for order more desperate, than in the heart of Central Asia. This was the region known to the Arabs as Mawarannahr, which simply means the land beyond the river. The river in question was the Amu Darya, the ancient Oxus. This was the homeland of legendary cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, ancient centers of learning and commerce. This land was the heart of what was left of the Chagatai Khanate, the slice of the Mongol Empire bequeathed to Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai. But by the 1340s, this Khanate too had split into two warring halves. The eastern part, a wild land of nomadic horsemen, was called Mogulistan. The western part was Mawarannahr itself, the settled land of cities and farms. But Mawarannahr was anything but settled. It had become an arena of endless, savage conflict. Dozens of local chieftains, leaders of Turco-Mongolic tribes known as emirs, fought like wolves over the carcass of the old Khanate. Every city had its own ruler, every valley its own warlord. They made alliances one day and betrayed them the next. They waged constant petty wars against each other, bleeding the land dry and making life for the common people an unbearable nightmare. The authority of the nominal Khans had become a joke. They were mere puppets, installed and deposed at the whim of the most powerful emirs. This was a land without a master, a cauldron of ambition, violence, and treachery. It was the perfect forge for a new kind of leader. A leader who understood its brutality, who could speak its language of violence, and who possessed the ruthless will to dominate it completely. In the year 1336, into this broken and violent world, in a small village not far from the city of Kesh, a boy was born. They named him Timur. It meant iron, and no name in history would ever prove to be more fitting. This child of iron was born on April 9, 1336. He entered the world in a small village named Koja Ilgur, just south of the city of Kesh. Today, this city is known as Shakrasabs, the Green City, located in modern-day Uzbekistan. He was not born into a royal palace. He was born into the rough, pragmatic world of the minor military aristocracy. His family belonged to the Barlas, one of the many tribes that defined the landscape of Mawarannahr. And to understand Timur, one must first understand the Barlas. They were a people of fascinating contradiction. By blood, they were Mongols. Their ancestors had ridden with Chagatai, the second son of Genghis Khan, when he first conquered this land a century earlier. But a century is a long time. The Barlas, like many of the Mongol tribes who settled here, had gone native. They had long since abandoned the windswept plains of Mongolia, the nomadic shamanism of their forefathers, and the Mongol language itself. They had converted to Sunni Islam, the dominant religion of the region. They had intermarried with the local population and adopted their language, Chagatai Turkic, and they were deeply immersed in the high culture of Persia, which had defined art, poetry, and administration in this part of the world for 1,000 years. Timur was the perfect product of this fusion. He was a child of two worlds. By religion, he was a devout Muslim. By language, he was a native Turkic speaker. By culture, he was Perso-Islamic. But in his mind, in his ambition, and in his military traditions, he was a Mongol. He did not revere the caliphs of Baghdad as much as he revered Genghis Khan, whose laws and military system, the Yasa, he considered the ultimate code of conduct for a conqueror. This dual identity would define his entire life. He would use Islam to justify his wars to the settled peoples, and the legacy of Genghis to command the loyalty of his nomadic armies. His father, Taragai, was the chieftain of his small branch of the Barlas. But this was not a grand title. It meant he controlled some pastures, some herds, and a small retinue of loyal soldiers. He was respected, but he was not a kingmaker. He was not one of the great emirs who manipulated the puppet khans. In fact, historical accounts suggest Taragai was a pious and quiet man, more interested in religion and scholarly discussion than in the brutal power politics of the age. He represented the settled Islamic side of Timur's heritage. This meant Timur was not born into supreme power. He had a respectable name, but no great army or wealth. He was, in essence, a young aristocrat with everything to prove. The legends surrounding his ancestry, which he himself likely encouraged, tried to build a grander narrative. His family claimed descent from a respected commander in Genghis Khan's army. But another, more potent myth tried to link his bloodline to the same distant legendary ancestor as Genghis Khan himself. This was a crucial piece of propaganda. Timur could never claim to be a Genghis-ID, a direct descendant of the Great Khan, which was the only bloodline that could legally rule. But by claiming a shared ancestor, he was subtly telling the world that he was of the same sacred stock, a spiritual brother to the great conqueror. His childhood was not one of study and comfort. It was a constant, rigorous preparation for war. This was a world of leather, felt, and steel. Before he could properly walk, he was placed on a horse. His education was the steppe itself. He mastered the composite bow, a devastatingly powerful weapon capable of piercing armor. He spent his days on long, grueling hunts that were not sport, but complex military exercises in tracking, envelopment, and logistics. He and his companions would have played games like Kokboru, a violent contest on horseback involving the carcass of a goat, which was, in reality, a chaotic cavalry drill that taught ruthless competition and masterful horsemanship. His textbook was not the Quran, though he would learn that too, but the epic oral histories of Genghis Khan's conquests, recited by firelight. He was being shaped into a leader, and nature had given him the raw materials. When Soviet archaeologists, led by Mikhail Gerasimov, opened his tomb in 1941, they reconstructed his appearance from his skeleton. The barbarian stereotype was shattered. Timur was tall for his era, standing around 172 or 173 centimeters, about 5 feet 8 inches. In a time when the average man was much shorter, he would have seemed like a giant. He was not a wiry nomad. He was powerfully built with unusually broad shoulders. Gerasimov noted that he was unusually strong, a man of Herculean build. This imposing physical presence would have given him a natural aura of command. His personality, too, was forged in this demanding environment. Legends describe him as a boy of intense focus. He was serious, reserved, and possessed a penetrating gaze that unnerved those around him. He rarely laughed. Unlike many of his peers, he was not prone to fits of passion or drunken rages. He was a listener, a calculator. He would sit for hours absorbing information, playing chess, a game at which he would become a master, even allegedly inventing his own more complex version. He understood from his earliest days that power was not just taken by force. It was assembled, piece by piece, through careful calculation. When his father, Tamerlane, died around 1360, Timur was in his early 20s. As a younger son, he did not inherit his father's main title or lands. He was left with a prestigious name, a powerful physique, a brilliant mind, and a burning, all-consuming ambition. He was a man with a prestigious name but no land, no army, and no title. He would have to build all of it from nothing, using the only currency that mattered in Mawarannahr: loyalty, charisma, and a capacity for strategic violence. In the wake of his father's death, Timur was a man set adrift in a sea of chaos. He had a name, but no army. He had ambition, but no lands. In the brutal political arena of Mawarannahr, a man in his position had only one path to power. It was not through inheritance or diplomacy. It was the path of the Kondurcha, the freelance warlord. He had to build a following from scratch. To do this, he turned to the ancient traditions of the steppe. In this world, a leader's worth was not measured in titles, but in the number of armed men who would follow him to the death. These followers were known by a specific Turco-Mongol term, noker. A noker was not a simple soldier or a feudal vassal. A vassal serves a title. A noker serves a man. He was a sworn companion, a brother in arms, who had voluntarily left his own tribe and family to pledge his life and loyalty to a single charismatic leader in exchange for protection, wealth, and glory. Genghis Khan himself had begun his rise to power by gathering his first nokers. Now Timur would do the same. But how does a landless young man attract such followers? He cannot offer them estates or high office. He must offer them two things: the promise of future glory and the immediate reality of loot. This is where the historical accounts of Timur's youth become uncomfortable for his later, more polished chroniclers. The earliest sources, as well as local legends, are clear. Timur became a raider. In modern terms, he became a bandit and a sheep stealer. His court historians, writing when he was the most powerful man in the world, would later try to romanticize this period. They spun tales of a noble Robin Hood, claiming he stole from corrupt officials to give to the poor. This was almost certainly propaganda, but it contains a grain of truth. He did steal from the rich, that is, from other tribes and warlords, but he gave to the poor, that is, his own followers. He was not a social revolutionary. He was a pragmatic military entrepreneur. These early raids were his school of survival and his primary recruitment tool. Each successful raid on a flock of sheep or a herd of horses proved several things at once. It proved his personal courage, as he always led from the front. It proved his tactical skill in planning, stealth, and rapid movement. And most importantly, it provided the capital to arm and feed his growing band. With each raid, his reputation grew. Other young men, other landless sons of minor nobles, tough-skinned adventurers, and outcasts from other tribes, heard of this bold and generous new leader, and they began to seek him out. His first followers were not high-born aristocrats. They were men like him, hungry, ambitious, and with nothing to lose. They formed the nucleus of what would become the most formidable army on earth. These men were not just his soldiers. They were his inner circle, his personal guard. They shared his horse meat by the campfire, starved with him when raids went poorly, and froze with him in the mountain passes. This forged a bond of loyalty that was absolute, a bond far stronger than any oath of vassalage. He was not their master. He was their chief, their elder brother. This period cemented the key traits of his personality. First, his strategic generosity. Timur understood instinctively that loyalty must be rewarded. He kept little of the spoils for himself, instead distributing horses, armor, and silver lavishly among his men. This reputation for open-handedness made his warriors fanatically devoted. They knew that while serving him was dangerous, the rewards were immense. Second, his deep-seated mistrust of others. He learned to rely only on this small circle of men whose loyalty had been tested in fire. He would always trust his own nokers, the men he had personally chosen, more than any allied tribe or high-ranking emir. He was also, by necessity, a master of deception and cunning. He had to be smarter than his rivals. He had to know when to fight, when to run, and when to be invisible. He would later write in his memoirs, "I had to deal with enemies hidden and open. I endured many hardships and troubles." He learned to read the shifting alliances of the region, to play one warlord against another, and to appear non-threatening until the perfect moment to strike. This was not a brief or easy period. It lasted for several years in the early 1360s. He was a small fish in a pond full of predators. There were moments when he was hunted, when his small band was scattered, and he was reduced to a fugitive with only a handful of companions. But he never broke. Each setback was a lesson. Each escape hardened his resolve. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Timur was no longer just the obscure son of a minor chieftain. He was a somebody. He was a young warlord with a growing reputation. He commanded a small, but utterly fanatical war band of veterans, bound to him by personal oaths and shared plunder. He had no land, no great title, but he had a force. And in the anarchic world of Mawarannahr, a loyal armed force was the most valuable asset a man could possess. He was now a player on the great chessboard, ready to make his first move. As Timur's reputation as a formidable young warlord grew, so did the stakes. He was no longer just stealing sheep from local tribes. He was now inserting himself into the larger, deadlier conflicts of the region. His growing warband needed more than just plunder. It needed a purpose. He began to operate in the volatile borderlands of Mawarannahr and Khorasan, the region of modern-day Afghanistan and Iran. It was here, around the year 1362, that an event occurred that would fundamentally change his life, his identity, and his name forever. The exact details of this incident are shrouded in the fog of war and competing legends. His own court chroniclers would later claim he received his wounds while fighting a holy war against infidels. This was, again, almost certainly propaganda designed to ennoble a rather gritty event. A more hostile Persian historian, writing later, claimed he was shot by a shepherd while trying to steal his sheep, a story designed to humiliate him. The most likely truth lies somewhere in between. He was engaged in a fierce skirmish or a regional battle in Sistan, in southern Afghanistan, fighting for a local ruler. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic. During the chaotic fight, Timur was struck by multiple arrows. At least 2 of them found their mark with devastating precision. One arrow pierced his right shoulder, severing tendons and muscles, and crippling his right arm for life. He would never again be able to fully raise that arm or hold a sword with it. Another arrow, perhaps two, struck his right leg. One may have shattered his hip, and another pierced his knee. The wounds were horrific. He was dragged from the battlefield by his loyal nokers, bleeding profusely and hovering on the brink of death. For a normal man in the 14th century, such wounds would have been an absolute death sentence. Even if he survived the initial blood loss, the almost certain infection that followed would have killed him days later. For a warrior whose entire life and career depended on his physical prowess, his ability to ride, to shoot, and to lead a cavalry charge, it was something even worse than death. It was the end. He was destined to become a cripple, a forgotten has-been in a world that had no pity for weakness. But Timur was not a normal man. He survived. He lay in agony for months, his iron constitution battling the infections and fevers. And as his body slowly, painfully mended, his mind was being reforged in the same fire. He would never walk properly again. He would have a pronounced, dragging limp for the rest of his life. His right arm would be permanently weakened, 2 fingers partially paralyzed. He had become, in the harsh language of his enemies, Timur Ilang. This was a Persian phrase of contempt. It meant Timur the Lame. In the Turkic tongue, he was Timur Aksak. Through European languages, this name would be corrupted into the one we know today, Tamerlane. For any other leader, this would have been a source of profound shame, a weakness to be hidden. But Timur, with his characteristic genius for controlling his own narrative, did the exact opposite. He embraced it. He did not hide his limp. He made it a centerpiece of his identity. He did not retire from the field. He returned to the saddle, a more terrifying figure than ever before. He transformed a physical liability into an unparalleled psychological weapon. His new identity was a calculated performance. When he appeared before his men, or especially before his enemies, they saw a man who should be dead. They saw a man who had endured wounds that would have killed 10 ordinary soldiers, yet he was still here, still in command, his eyes still burning with that same cold, calculating intelligence. His limp was not a sign of weakness. It was a testament to his supernatural will. He was the man who could not be killed. The name his enemies gave him as an insult, he adopted as a badge of honor. He was, in his own mind and in the minds of his followers, the Iron Lame. The iron was not just in his name. It was in his bones, in his will. This event also solidified his military style. No longer able to be the foremost fighter in a charge, he completed his transformation into the foremost commander. He became the chess master, directing the battle from a strategic vantage point. His mind his primary weapon. His physical limitations forced him to rely on his intellect, his charisma, and his terrifying aura. He would sit on his horse on a hilltop, a living statue of iron will, directing his devoted warriors like pieces on his personal chessboard. The psychological effect on his soldiers was profound. They saw their leader, a man physically broken but spiritually indomitable, and they drew strength from it. If their chief could endure such pain and still lead them, what right did they have to falter? His enemies, too, were unnerved. They were fighting something more than a man. They were fighting a legend, a grim figure who had seemingly returned from the dead, dragging his ruined leg as a reminder of his own impossible survival. He had successfully created his own myth, and he was only 26 years old. With his new terrifying identity and his small but fanatical army, the Iron Lame was now ready to challenge the great emirs for control of Mawarannahr itself. Timur, now the Iron Lame, a figure of growing legend, commanded a formidable warband. But he was a realist. He knew that charisma and a loyal armed guard were not enough to conquer a kingdom. He was still just one of many predators in the jungle of Mawarannahr. To challenge the true masters of the land, he needed something he did not possess: legitimacy. He needed an ally who had the one thing he lacked: a powerful name and a claim to high authority. He found that man in his contemporary, Emir Husayn. Husayn was, in many ways, Timur's opposite. While Timur was building his power from nothing, Husayn was trying to reclaim a power that was his by birthright. He was the grandson of Emir Kazaghan, the last man to have truly ruled all of Mawarannahr as a kingmaker, a de facto ruler who controlled the puppet khans. After Kazaghan's assassination, his empire had crumbled, and his family lost its grip on power. Husayn, his grandson, was now a landless prince, just like Timur. But unlike Timur, Husayn's name resonated with the old guard. He was the legitimate heir to the last stable government, and many of the older emirs and tribes looked to him as the natural leader to restore order. Timur was the new money, a charismatic up-from-nothing warlord. Husayn was the old money, an aristocrat with a pedigree, even if his lands were lost. Sometime around 1360 or 1361, these two young, ambitious men found each other, and they recognized that they were the perfect partners. Husayn had the legitimacy and the broad-based political support. Timur had the fanatically loyal nokers and a singular, ruthless military genius. Together, they were a complete package. They formed an alliance, a sworn brotherhood. They would work as one, pooling their resources to destroy their common enemies and restore order to Mawarannahr. This was not just a cold, political calculation. It was a genuine partnership, at least at first. These were two young men in their mid-20s, both brilliant, both ambitious, both having lost their fathers, both fighting for survival and glory. They saw themselves as the heroes of a new age, destined to clear out the corrupt and petty warlords who were bleeding the country dry. They were brothers in arms. To seal this pact, a marriage was arranged. It was the most important marriage of Timur's life. He was given the hand of Husayn's sister, the beautiful and high-born princess Aljai Turkanaga. This was a massive social coup for Timur, the son of a minor chieftain. It immediately elevated his status. But by all accounts, this was more than a political match. Timur, a man generally cold and calculating, seems to have genuinely and deeply loved Aljai. She became his chief wife, his trusted advisor, and a stabilizing influence in his life. Her death a few years later in childbirth would devastate him and, perhaps not coincidentally, would mark the beginning of the end for his relationship with her brother. But for now, with this marriage, the bond between Timur and Husayn was as tight as it could possibly be. They were now family. Their primary enemy was a foreign one. The chaos in Mawarannahr had become so severe that the ruler of the other half of the old Khanate, Tughlaq Timur, the Khan of Mogulistan, saw his chance. He invaded Mawarannahr under the pretext of restoring order and installing his son as governor. In reality, it was a brutal conquest. The local emirs were powerless to stop him. Many of them, in a display of the treachery Timur so despised, simply defected to the invader to save their own skins. It was during this invasion in 1360 that Timur first displayed his political cunning. While many emirs fought and lost, or fled, Timur and his father Terek, who was still alive at this point, chose a different path. They submitted to the Khan. Timur, the pragmatist, saw that resistance was futile. He entered the service of the Mughal invader, who, impressed by this confident young warlord, confirmed him as the ruler of his home city of Kesh. This was Timur's first taste of real legitimate governorship. But this service was a ruse. Timur was a wolf pretending to be a sheepdog. He used his position to gather intelligence, build his own power base, and wait. When the Khan of Mogulistan returned home, leaving his son in charge, Timur knew his time was coming. The Mughal rule was unpopular, their soldiers seen as foreign oppressors. Emir Husayn, meanwhile, had chosen a different path. He had refused to bow to the Mughals and had fled into exile, attempting to wage a futile resistance. This made him a popular hero, but an ineffective one. Now Timur saw his moment. The Mughal prince who governed Mawarannahr began to grow suspicious of his ambitious new vassal, Timur, whose power was growing too quickly. Sensing the danger, Timur abandoned his post at Kesh, gathered his loyal nokers, and rode out into the wilderness. He was now an outlaw, a rebel, and there was only one man he could turn to: his brother-in-law and sworn ally, Emir Husayn. He rode to join Husayn in his exile, and the two-man alliance now became a full-blown rebellion. The stage was set for one of the most romantic and harrowing periods of Timur's life: his time as a hunted fugitive. The life of an outlaw was a brutal teacher. Timur and Husayn, now united, were fugitives. They were hunted by the superior forces of the Mughal governor, Ilyas Khoja. They had no cities, no treasury, no supply lines. Their only resource was their own reputation and the hardened loyalty of the few hundred horsemen who followed them. They became ghosts of the steppe, living in the saddle, their faces burned by the wind and sun. They waged a desperate guerrilla war, striking at Mughal patrols, capturing horses, and disappearing back into the unforgiving wilderness of the Kizil-Kum desert or the rocky gorges of the Hindu Kush. This period was their crucible, and it forged Timur's legend in hardship. The stories of this time are raw and desperate. There were moments when their small band was scattered, and Timur was left with only a handful of followers. At one point, he and his wife Al-Jai were left with only 2 horses. When one of them collapsed from exhaustion, Timur, the future conqueror of the world, was forced to carry his pregnant wife on his own back through the desert night. Their lowest point came when they sought refuge in the lands to the south, near Herat. They hoped to find allies, but instead they found betrayal. A local chieftain, suspicious and greedy, arrested Timur, Husayn, and their small band. They were not treated as captured royalty. They were thrown into a vile, filthy dungeon, a stable infested with lice and vermin, and left to rot for over 60 days. This was the ultimate humiliation for 2 men who believed they were destined to rule. It was in this dark, lice-ridden cell that the fundamental difference between the 2 men began to show. Husayn, the aristocrat who felt he was entitled to rule, fell into a deep despair. He saw this as the end, a pathetic conclusion to his family's grand legacy. But Timur, the self-made man who had already survived the impossible, saw it only as another obstacle. He never lost his composure. He kept his mind sharp, planning, encouraging his men, and radiating an aura of absolute, unbreakable will. Even in the depths of that fetid prison, his followers looked at him and believed in their eventual escape. When they were finally released, not by force, but because their captor realized they were more trouble than they were worth, they were destitute. They were beggars. It was at this moment that Timur's wife, Husayn's own sister, Al-Jai Turkan, made her greatest sacrifice. She took the last of her valuable possessions, her pearl earrings or a heavy necklace, and sold them in the bazaar, not for a palace, but for a single horse, some food, and a few skins of water, just so they could escape. It was a sacrifice Timur would never forget. They returned to Mawarannahr with nothing, having lost everything except their lives. But a strange thing had happened. Their suffering had not made them weak. It had made them legends. The story of their escape, their imprisonment, and their indomitable will spread like wildfire. They were no longer just minor rebels. They were symbols of resistance. And they returned at the perfect moment. The Mughal occupiers had proven to be brutal and greedy masters. Their taxes were crippling, their soldiers arrogant. In the great city of Samarkand, the people had reached their breaking point. A popular uprising exploded in the city, led not by aristocrats, but by the common people. Craftsmen, students, and laborers. They called themselves the Sarbazars, a Persian name meaning heads on the block, or the Gallowbirds. They were men who had sworn an oath to fight to the death, for they had nothing left to lose. The Sarbazars were brave and zealous. and they succeeded in throwing the Mughal garrison out of Samarkand. But they were a mob, not an army. They had passion, but they lacked military leadership. And now they heard the news. Timur and Husayn, the two legendary princes of the resistance, had returned. It was a perfect match. The Sarbazars had a city and an army, but no general. Timur and Husayn had their military genius and legitimacy, but no army. They immediately rode to Samarkand and were hailed as liberators. The people flocked to their banner. In 1365, the Mughal Khan, Ilyas Khoja, returned with a massive army to crush this rebellion. The forces met on the banks of the Chirchiq River in a clash that would be known as the Battle of the Mud. A freak torrential downpour turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Timur, commanding the vanguard, fought with his usual brilliance, but Husayn, commanding the main body, hesitated. His indecision turned the tide, and their new army was routed. Timur and Husayn were forced to flee Samarkand once again, abandoning it to the Mughals. But as the Mughals besieged the city, the Sarbazar defenders fought with such suicidal fanaticism that the Mughal army, already weakened by a spreading plague, simply broke. Ilyas Khoja, his army disintegrating, lifted the siege and retreated back to Mogulistan, never to return. Mawarannahr was free. Timur and Husayn, emerging from their hiding place, rode back into Samarkand. This time they were not just rebels. They were the undisputed masters of the realm. They had won. They had fought together, starved together, and been imprisoned together. And now they ruled together. The only question left was, for how long? For a kingdom that had been won by two men was now a kingdom with two masters. The joint rule of Timur and Husayn was doomed from the start. It was a partnership forged in desperation, and it could not survive the pressures of peace. Now that their common enemy, the Mughals, had been expelled, the fundamental differences between the two men, which had been papered over during their exile, erupted to the surface. Mawarannahr was not big enough for both of them. The city of Samarkand, which they had liberated, became the heart of their new government. But almost immediately, their personalities and governing styles clashed. Husayn, as the grandson of Emir Kazaghan, saw himself as the senior partner, the legitimate ruler. He began to consolidate power in the traditional way. He hoarded wealth, levied heavy taxes on the merchants and citizens, including the Sarbazars who had helped him, and started building grand palaces for himself. He was an aristocrat, and he believed the purpose of ruling was to be rich and powerful. Timur operated on a completely different philosophy. He was a soldier's general. He despised the trappings of palace life and cared little for personal luxury. He understood that his power came not from a bloodline, but from the ironclad loyalty of his army. And he knew that loyalty had to be paid for, not with taxes, but with plunder. He was famously, even strategically, generous. He took the wealth from his campaigns and distributed it lavishly among his emirs and soldiers. This made him wildly popular with the military, the most important faction in the state. A rift began to form. Husayn's men saw Timur as a dangerous populist, an upstart who was buying the army's loyalty. Timur's men saw Husayn as a greedy, arrogant, and untrustworthy miser who was stealing the rewards of their shared struggle. The tension was palpable. The two men, once brothers, now sat at opposite ends of the council chamber. Their brotherhood a cold formality. The final, personal link between them was severed in 1365. Timur's beloved wife, Al-Jai Turkan Aga, Husayn's sister, the woman who had sold her jewels for him in the desert, died. With her death, the last emotional bond between the two rivals was gone. Now, Husayn was no longer Timur's brother-in-law. He was just the man in his way. The Cold War quickly turned hot. For the next 5 years, from 1365 to 1370, Mawarannahr was plunged back into a bloody civil war. But this was not the chaos of petty warlords. It was a focused strategic duel between the two most powerful men in the kingdom. They fought, they made truces, they divided the realm between them, and they betrayed each other, all while smiling at formal banquets. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering. Timur, the superior tactician, generally won the open battles. But Husayn, with his greater wealth and legitimacy, held the major cities and fortresses, like his stronghold at Balkh. It was a stalemate. Timur knew he could not win with brute force alone. He had to use his greatest weapon, his mind. He began a campaign of political and psychological warfare. He presented himself to the other emirs and tribes as the true heir to the traditions of Genghis Khan, a generous leader, a fair judge, and a protector of the common soldier, in stark contrast to the greedy and elitist Husayn. He also used religion, projecting himself as a devout Sunni Muslim, while painting Husayn as impious. One by one, the minor emirs and tribes who had supported Husayn began to defect, drawn to Timur's charisma, his reputation for victory, and most of all, his open hand. The final confrontation came in 1370. Timur had assembled a massive coalition of emirs who had all grown to despise Husayn. He cornered his rival in the ancient and heavily fortified city of Balkh, in modern-day Afghanistan. This was Husayn's capital, his final bastion. Timur laid siege to the city. It was not a long siege. Husayn's support had evaporated. His soldiers, seeing the massive army at the gates and knowing Timur's reputation for both mercy to those who surrendered and total annihilation for those who resisted, lost their will to fight. The city fell. Husayn was captured. He was brought before Timur as a prisoner. The two men who had shared a prison cell, starved in the desert, and ruled a kingdom together, now stood face to face for the last time. Timur, ever the master of propaganda, made a public show of his dilemma. He allegedly wept, remembering their old brotherhood and the memory of his wife. He publicly declared that he wanted to spare Husayn's life. But he knew he couldn't. Husayn was too dangerous. His name too powerful. To let him live was to invite another war. Timur could not be seen to order the execution of his sworn brother and brother-in-law. So he allowed politics to take its course. One of Timur's emirs, whose own brother had been executed by Husayn years earlier, stepped forward and demanded the right of qisas, the ancient law of blood vengeance. Timur, with a show of great reluctance, permitted it. Husayn was led away and quietly executed. Timur had won. His rival was dead. He had played the game of survival, the game of loyalty, and the game of thrones. And he had checkmated everyone. At the age of 34, he rode from the gates of Balkh to his capital of Samarkand. There was no one left to challenge him. He was the sole, undisputed, and absolute master of Mawarannahr. In the spring of 1370, Timur stood as the undisputed master of Mawarannahr. He was 34 years old, and he had achieved the impossible. He had risen from a landless raider to the sole ruler of a kingdom, eliminating every rival in his path. But his victory at Balkh presented him with an immediate and seemingly unsolvable problem. It was a problem of blood. He had all the power, but he had no right to rule. In the vast Turco-Mongol world that stretched across Asia, there was one unbreakable law, a tradition held as sacred. Only a man who could trace his ancestry directly back to Genghis Khan, a Genghis-ID, could hold the supreme title of Khan. This was not just a political rule. It was a spiritual one. The Genghis-ID line was seen as divinely ordained, blessed by the eternal blue sky to rule the world. Timur, for all his genius and power, was not a Genghis-ID. He was from the Barlas tribe, a minor noble line. He could be a general, a chieftain, a kingmaker, but he could never be Khan. This was the great filter of steppe politics. Any other warlord who had reached this point would have two choices, both of them bad. First, He could simply ignore the tradition and declare himself Khan anyway. This would have been an act of extreme arrogance, a sacrilege that would have turned many of the other emirs and tribes against him, branding him an illegitimate usurper. His own army, built from tribes who revered the Gengis legacy, might have fractured. Second, he could rule from the shadows, just as his rival Husayn's grandfather had, pulling the strings of a puppet Khan. This was effective, but it was also a sign of weakness, a tacit admission that he was not the true master. Timur, the chess master, chose a third path. It was a move of such breathtaking political genius that it would define his entire reign and the empire he built. He did not break the sacred law. He did not ignore it. He simply built a new system around it, creating a perfect political fiction that satisfied tradition while giving him absolute, total control. First, he called a Kurultai, the great assembly of all the tribes and emirs, just as Genghis Khan himself had done. This assembly, held at his capital of Samarkand, was his first act as ruler. But he did not ask them to elect him as Khan. Instead, he discovered an obscure and powerless man named Tokhtamysh, who happened to be a legitimate Genghis ID. Timur formally proclaimed this man as the new great Khan of the Chagatai Khanate. The traditions were satisfied. The emirs bowed. The sacred bloodline was officially on the throne. Second, he defined his own title. He rejected all royal trappings. He took the simple military title he had always held, Emir. It meant commander or general. On paper, he was merely the humble, loyal servant of the new great Khan. All coins were minted in the Khan's name. All official decrees were issued on the Khan's authority. But in reality, the Khan was a prisoner. He was a non-entity, confined to a palace in Samarkand, a rubber stamp for Timur's will. The Khan reigned, but the Emir ruled. This legal sleight of hand was brilliant. It gave his rivals nothing to attack. He wasn't a usurper. He was a humble servant, restoring the legitimate line. He wasn't a king. He was just a general, enforcing the Khan's law. But he was the general who commanded every soldier, controlled every coin, and held the power of life and death over every subject, including the Khan himself. But Timur didn't stop there. He needed to bind himself to the sacred family personally. He needed to get inside the royal house. He found the perfect opportunity. Among the spoils of his victory over Husayn was his rival's widow, the Princess Saray Mulk Khanum. She was not just any woman. She was a direct blue-blooded Genghis ID princess. Timur, whose own beloved wife had died years before, now married her. This was his masterstroke. This marriage was not about love. It was about politics. By marrying a Genghis ID princess, Timur was awarded a new, prestigious title, Gurajan. This was a Mongol term meaning royal son-in-law. Now, his full title was Emir Timur Gurajan, the Commander Timur, the Khan's son-in-law. This title was the key to his entire empire. He could not be the father of the dynasty, so he became the son. As a member of the Khan's own family, he now had the legal and traditional right to live in the royal palace, to act on the Khan's behalf, and to command the Genghis ID armies as one of their own. He had neutralized his one great weakness and turned it into a strength. He had created a legal framework for his dictatorship, one that was so clever, so respectful of tradition, that it was unassailable. He was now, in every sense, the legitimate and absolute ruler of the new order he was about to build. With Mawarannahr now firmly in his grasp and his political legitimacy established, the 34-year-old emir was no longer just a warlord. He was a statesman, the master of a kingdom, and the mind that had brought him from outlaw to ruler was now free to look beyond its borders. To understand the campaigns that would follow, the invasions that would reshape the map of the world, one must first understand the unique and chilling intellect of the man who planned them. Perhaps the most revealing key to Timur's mind is a fact that is not a metaphor. He was, literally, a grandmaster of chess. He was not just a casual player. He was obsessed with the game. He found the standard version of his day too simple, too limited. He famously sponsored and helped design a far more complex and massive version, known as Tamerlane chess. It was played on a board of 112 squares, with pieces that had unique and complex movements. The giraffe, the picket, the camel, and the war engine. It was a game of immense strategic depth, requiring a player to think 10, 15, 20 moves ahead. This was not a pastime. It was how his brain was wired. He saw the entire world as one of his massive chessboards. And he played to win. First, a chess master sees the whole board. Timur was one of the first rulers in history to practice true global geopolitics. He did not see Mawarannahr, Persia, the Golden Horde, India, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire as separate problems. He saw them as one interconnected system of pieces. He understood that a move against the Ottomans in the West would affect his rivalry with Egypt. He knew that weakening the Golden Horde in the north would change the flow of trade from China. His mind was a map, and on it, he was constantly calculating the ripples of every action. Second, a chess master gathers information. Timur never ever made a move blind. He built what was arguably the most sophisticated and terrifying intelligence network of the medieval world. His spies were not just soldiers in disguise. He sent agents posing as mystical dervishes and wandering holy men, who could travel unmolested, listening in mosques and marketplaces. He sent them as merchants, who would set up shop in enemy cities for years, mapping their fortifications, identifying their water sources, and assessing the morale of their people. He sent them as scholars and scribes, who would infiltrate the courts of his rivals, learning their secrets, their weaknesses, and the fractures in their political alliances. By the time Timur's army arrived at an enemy's border, he already knew more about their kingdom than they did. He knew which generals were jealous of each other, which ministers were open to a bribe, and exactly how much grain was in their storehouses. Third, a chess master understands tempo and patience. Timur was not an impulsive raider. He was terrifyingly patient. He would spend years setting up the perfect checkmate. He would let his rivals, like the Sultan Bayezid or the Khan Tokhtamysh, overextend themselves, grow arrogant, and make a fatal mistake. He let them move first, studying their style, before launching a perfectly timed counterattack that was not just a battle, but the end of the game. Finally, a chess master plays the opponent, not just the pieces. This is the most crucial and most terrifying aspect of Timur's mind. He understood psychology, and he used it to destroy his enemies before the first arrow was ever fired. This cold calculation extended to his most infamous tactic: his use of systematic psychological terror. The towers of skulls that would become his trademark were not the acts of a man lost in a fit of rage. They were a calculated policy, a move on the chessboard. His logic was a kind of terrible arithmetic. If he besieged a city, and it resisted, his army would suffer casualties. It would cost him time, money, and most importantly, his elite soldiers. If he simply marched to the next city, it too would resist. But if he made an example of the first city, if he took it, slaughtered its garrison, and built horrific monuments from their skulls as a warning, the next 10 cities on his path would be paralyzed by fear. Their will to fight would be broken. They would send their keys to him while he was still miles away, begging for mercy. The execution of 70,000 at Isfahan, or the live burial of 4,000 soldiers at Shivas, as horrific as these events were a message. It was a calculated sacrifice of one piece on the board to clear the rest. He was telling the world, resistance is not just futile, it is an act of suicide. If you fight me, this is your fate. If you submit, I will be a just though strict master. It was the ultimate psychological warfare. He was not just conquering cities. He was conquering the minds of his enemies. This cold, patient, hyper-intelligent, and utterly ruthless mind was now in complete control of Mawarannahr. He was not just a warrior. He was a grandmaster. And the game for the world had just begun. This grandmaster, who saw the world as his personal chessboard, operated within a mental framework that was as complex and dualistic as his own ancestry. To understand Timur is to understand the two often contradictory sets of laws that he lived by. He had a dual-track mind, governed by two codes, one for his soul and one for his sword. These codes were the Sharia and the Yasa. First, there was Sharia. This was the sacred, revealed law of Islam. Timur was, by all public accounts and actions, a devout Sunni Muslim. This was not a mere political convenience. His piety appears to have been genuine. He prayed 5 times a day. He financed the construction of some of the most magnificent mosques and religious schools in human history. He was not an uneducated soldier. He was a master of theological debate. He surrounded himself with the ulama, the great Islamic scholars, and would spend long nights engaged in complex arguments about the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence. He knew his holy book as well as they did. He used Sharia as his primary tool of civilian government and his public justification for conquest. For the settled, civilized Perso-Islamic populations of his empire, the merchants of Samarkand, the artisans of Herat, the citizens of Shiraz, he was the sword of Islam. He was the Ghazi, the holy warrior, a champion of the Orthodox faith. His wars against non-Muslims, like his later invasion of India, were easily justified as a righteous jihad. Even his wars against other Muslims were framed through a religious lens. He was punishing them for being bad Muslims, for failing to uphold the Sharia, for being lax, corrupt, or heretical. Sharia was his public face, the source of his legitimacy as a civilized king. But beneath this public face was a second, older, and far more ruthless set of rules. This was the Yasa. The Yasa was the great, unwritten, or perhaps secretly written, code of Genghis Khan. It was the ancestral law of the steppe, the military and imperial code of the Mongol world. The Yasa was not concerned with morality, salvation, or the afterlife. It was concerned with 3 things: order, discipline, and loyalty. The Yasa was a pragmatic military constitution. It dictated the organization of the army into units of 10, 100, and 1,000. It established the Yam, the rapid postal service that bound the empire together. And its core principle was absolute, unquestioning obedience to the supreme ruler. The punishment for failure, desertion, or disloyalty was not imprisonment. It was almost universally death. The Yasa was the law of the army, the law of the camp, the law of the conqueror. It was the law of his Mongol heritage. Timur, the child of 2 worlds, lived his entire life in the tension between these 2 codes. And the key to his success was his genius in knowing which code to apply and when. He was a master of code switching. In his capital, in his court, in his mosques, he was the pious emir, ruling by Sharia. On campaign, in his army, in a conquered city, he was the Mongol successor, ruling by Yasa. This is how he resolved the paradox of his own nature. How could a man who wept during prayers and debated theology also order the construction of a tower of skulls? Because in his mind, these actions were governed by different laws. The prayers were for God, as dictated by Sharia. The Tower of Skulls was a tool of statecraft, a calculated act of psychological warfare, perfectly permissible under the Yasa to ensure order and prevent future rebellion. And make no mistake, when these 2 codes came into direct conflict, the Yasa almost always won. If a soldier in his army committed theft, the Sharia might demand a trial and the amputation of a hand. The Yasa demanded immediate execution for upsetting the discipline of the camp. Timur used the Yasa. If one of his emirs questioned a direct order, the Sharia might allow for debate and counsel. The Yasa defined this as treason, punishable by death. This is why his army was the most disciplined and most terrified fighting force in the world. It did not run on Islamic law. It ran on the resurrected iron-willed law of Genghis Khan. He used this dualism to justify all his wars. When he attacked India, he was a Ghazi fulfilling Sharia. When he attacked the Golden Horde, a Muslim state, he was the restorer of Mongol order, punishing a traitor, Tokhtamysh, according to the Yasa. When he attacked the Ottoman Empire, another Muslim state, he was the supreme authority of the Mongol world, putting a subordinate, Bayezid, in his place according to the Yasa. This dual-track ideology made him unpredictable and unstoppable. His enemies could never be sure which Timur they were facing: the pious Muslim who might be reasoned with, or the avatar of Genghis Khan, for whom negotiation was just a prelude to annihilation. He was not a hypocrite. In his mind, he was the legitimate master of both systems. He was the emir, the commander, and his will was the ultimate law, drawing on whichever ancient code best served his singular purpose: the creation of a new world order forged in his own image. The Yasa was the iron code of discipline that bound Timur's army together. But a code is only as strong as the army that enforces it. And Timur's army was the single most lethal and sophisticated military machine of its age. It was not a chaotic horde of barbarians, as his victims often described it. It was a finely tuned instrument of conquest, a professional, multi-ethnic, and permanent force that combined the greatest strengths of two different worlds of warfare. It fused the terrifying mobility of the nomadic steppe with the methodical, scientific, and patient siegecraft of the settled empires. The foundation of this machine was a direct inheritance from Genghis Khan: the decimal system. This was the organizational skeleton of the army, and it was brutally simple and effective. The smallest unit was the arban, a squad of 10 men. These men were not just randomly grouped. They were often brothers, cousins, or men from the same village. They lived, ate, and fought together. Their loyalty was to each other, and their responsibility was total. If one man deserted, the other 9 might be executed. 10 arbans formed a zun, a company of 100 men led by a Yuzbashi. 10 zuns formed a mingan, a battalion of 1,000 men led by a minbashi. And 10 minghans formed the largest and most famous unit: the Tumun, a division of 10,000 warriors, commanded by an emir. This system was a revolution in loyalty. It deliberately broke down old tribal allegiances. A man was not a Barlas or a Jalair first. He was a soldier of the 3rd Tumun, 2nd Mingan. His loyalty was not to his old chieftain, but to his Yuzbashi, his Minbashi, and his emir. And all emirs answered to one man, Timur. It was a pyramid of ironclad obedience, where an order from the top could be transmitted down to the lowest squad of 10 in minutes. The muscle on this skeleton was the cavalry. Timur's force was, first and foremost, an army of horsemen. It was divided into 2 main types. First was the light cavalry. This was the classic warrior of the steppe, the descendant of the Mongol archer. These men were lightly armored, often with just a leather vest and a small helmet. Their primary weapon was the powerful composite bow, a masterpiece of laminated horn, wood, and sinew that could shoot arrows powerful enough to pierce chainmail. Their horses were small, fast, and incredibly tough. These soldiers were the army's eyes and ears. They fanned out for miles in every direction, scouting, mapping terrain, and finding water sources. In battle, they were a swirling, deadly cloud. They would ride just outside the enemy's range, showering them with arrows, provoking them, and luring them out of formation. They were masters of the most terrifying Mongol tactic: the feigned retreat, pretending to break and run, only to turn and envelop the pursuing disorganized enemy. But the second type was Timur's great innovation: the heavy cavalry. These were his shock troops, his knights. While the heavy cavalry of Europe was declining, Timur was perfecting it. These men were covered, and often their horses were too, in heavy lamellar or chainmail armor. Under the armor, they wore thick, quilted silk vests, a surprisingly effective defense, as arrows that pierced the mail would be caught in the silk fibers, allowing them to be pulled out of a wound more easily. These men were not armed with bows. They were armed with lances, heavy maces, and curved sabers. Their job was not to skirmish. Their job was to break the enemy. After the light cavalry had harassed, weakened, and disordered an enemy line, the heavy cavalry would form into a dense wedge and charge, a single, unstoppable avalanche of steel designed to shatter the enemy's center and trample them into the dust. This army was a multi-ethnic, professional force. The core was, of course, Timur's own Turco-Mongol Chagatai tribes, the men born in the saddle who made up the bulk of the cavalry. But as Timur conquered, he practiced a policy of military assimilation. When he defeated an army, he did not just slaughter them. He would identify the best, toughest, and most skilled survivors, and he would absorb them into his own forces. His army swelled with Persian infantry, Turkish horsemen, and warriors from all across the Middle East. Finally, this entire structure was run on two principles: absolute discipline and total meritocracy. The discipline of the Yasa was paramount. Plundering without permission was punishable by death. Fleeing from battle was punishable by death. An officer whose men broke rank would be demoted or executed. But the reward for success was just as extreme. Timur was a master of a meritocracy. He did not care if a man was highborn. He cared if he was good. He famously said, "A man's worth is the man himself." He would spot a common soldier who fought with exceptional bravery or cleverness, and he could promote him to Yuzbashi on the spot. Many of his greatest emirs, the commanders of his Tumun, were not great aristocrats. They were men who had started as his original nokers, his bandit companions, and had risen through the ranks purely on talent. This created an army that was not just disciplined, but also fanatically motivated. Every soldier knew that the only thing separating him from a general's baton was his own courage and skill. But this structure, as perfect as it was only half of the equation. A cavalry army, even the best in the world, wins on the open plain. It dies against high walls. And Timur knew that to conquer the world, he had to conquer its greatest cities. He needed a new kind of warfare. The cavalry made Timur the master of the open field. But it was the other half of his army, the half his nomadic ancestors lacked, that made him the master of the world. This was his corps of infantry specialists and, above all, his engineers. This was what separated Timur from Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's Mongols were a tidal wave of horsemen that often had to flow around the greatest fortified cities. Timur's army was an unstoppable glacier that ground them into dust. Timur understood that to build an empire you must control the cities. And to control cities you must be able to take them. He was a master of siege warfare, a cold, patient, and scientific destroyer. While his army was mostly cavalry, he also maintained a large professional corps of infantry. These were not just peasant levies. He had units of heavy infantry, clad in armor and carrying large shields and spears, who could defend his camp or march into the narrow, winding streets of a city where a horse was a liability. He had specialized mountain troops, recruited from the highlands of Afghanistan, who were expert climbers, capable of scaling fortress walls that were considered impregnable. But his true genius, his secret weapon, was his corps of engineers, sappers, and artillerymen. He was obsessed with siege technology. And just as he collected artists and scholars, he was a collector of military technicians. Every time he conquered a new land, Persia, Syria, Anatolia. He would identify the most skilled engineers, miners, woodworkers, and blacksmiths, and he would forcibly induct them into his army. His engineering corps was a multinational think tank of destruction, containing the best minds from across the known world. When this army arrived before a walled city, the defenders on the ramparts would watch in terror as a methodical, industrial process of destruction began. First came the sappers. This was Timur's specialty. He was a master of mining, or sapping. His engineers, protected by a constant barrage of arrows from his light cavalry, would begin digging. They would dig long, reinforced tunnels, working day and night, straight towards the base of the city's walls. When they reached the foundations, they would hollow out a large chamber directly underneath the wall, packing it with dry wood, pitch, and sulfur. Then, when the time was right, they would set it on fire. The supports would burn away, and a massive section of the city's stone wall would simply collapse into the ground, leaving a gaping breach for his heavy cavalry and infantry to pour into. Second came the artillery. Timur's army traveled with massive siege engines. He had batteries of trebuchets, the giant counterweighted catapults capable of hurling massive boulders that could shatter stone walls. He employed specialists in naphtha, or Greek fire, who would launch clay pots filled with this flammable liquid, setting the city's rooftops ablaze and creating panic within the walls. He also had batteries of giant crossbows, or ballistas, that could fire spear-like bolts with enough force to sweep defenders from the ramparts. Third was the psychological siege. Timur, the chess master, loved to break his enemies' morale. If a city was particularly defiant, he would order the construction of massive wooden towers, or siege castles, that were taller than the city's own walls. These would be rolled forward, and his archers would then stand on top, firing down onto the defenders, making it impossible for them to even stand on their own ramparts. He would famously order his army to make a terrifying, coordinated roar at a specific moment in the middle of the night, a sound so loud it mimicked an earthquake, shaking the defenders' will to fight. And finally, if all else failed, he would use engineering in its purest form. He was not above changing the course of nature itself to take a city. He would famously divert rivers from their beds to cut off a city's water supply, leaving them to die of thirst, or in one case, to intentionally flood the city. This combination made his army an all-terrain force. On the open plains of the steppe, his light and heavy cavalry were unbeatable. Against the mountain fortresses of Persia or the ancient massive walls of Syria, his corps of engineers and sappers were unstoppable. No plain was too vast for him to cross, and no wall was too high for him to breach. This was the machine Timur had built in the years after 1370. It was an army of professionals, bound by the iron discipline of the Yasa, fueled by a meritocracy of talent, and equipped with the mobility of the steppe and the finest siege science of the settled world. It had a single brain, Timur, and it had a single purpose: conquest. Now it was time to unleash it. By the late 1370s, Timur had consolidated his power in Mawarannahr. His capital, Samarkand, was secure. His army was disciplined and loyal. His political framework, the Emir, not Khan system, was a success. He was now ready to turn his gaze outward. He had 3 fronts, 3 theaters of operation. To the east lay Mogulistan, the land of his old enemies. To the south lay the fractured, chaotic, but fabulously wealthy remnants of the Ilkhanate in Persia. And to the north lay the vast grassy plains of the Deshti Kipchak, the realm of the Golden Horde. While Persia was the prize, the Golden Horde was the primary threat. It was a chaotic neighbor, prone to civil war, but still capable of unleashing massive armies. The region was in the midst of its great troubles, a decades-long civil war where rival khans rose and fell. Timur, the chess master, knew he could not invade Persia if his northern border was insecure. He needed to solve the problem of the Golden Horde. And in 1376, The solution walked right into his court. A young man arrived in Samarkand. He was a fugitive, defeated and hunted. But he was not just any refugee. He was Tokhtamysh, a prince of the blood, a direct Genghis-ID descendant of Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son. His rival, a powerful Khan named Urus, had murdered his father and was now trying to kill him. Tokhtamysh had fled with his life and was now begging the new Emir of Samarkand for sanctuary and help. Timur must have seen this as a gift from heaven. He looked at the defeated young prince and saw the perfect chess piece. He saw an opportunity of breathtaking scope. Why should he fight the entire Golden Horde, this nest of vipers? Why not just install his own Khan to rule it for him? He immediately welcomed Tokhtamysh with the highest honors. He called the young refugee son and treated him as royalty. He made him a guest in his palace, but in reality he was vetting him, studying his character. He found Tokhtamysh to be ambitious, energetic, and most importantly, completely dependent on him. Tokhtamysh was the perfect puppet. Timur's plan was simple. He would give Tokhtamysh an army and the resources to go north and seize his rightful throne. This would be a proxy war. If Tokhtamysh won, Timur would gain a massive, powerful, and eternally grateful buffer state on his northern border. He gave Tokhtamysh cities in his borderlands, Otrar and Sorin. He gave him money from his treasury. And he gave him a detachment of his own veteran troops. Tokhtamysh, overjoyed, launched his invasion. He was immediately and disastrously defeated by Urus Khan and came fleeing back to Samarkand, having lost the army Timur gave him. Many of Timur's emirs were furious. They saw Tokhtamysh as a failure and a drain on their resources. They advised Timur to cut his losses and abandon the young prince. But Timur was the patient chess master. This was an investment, not a gamble. He calmly overruled his emirs. He re-equipped Tokhtamysh, gave him another army, and sent him north again. And again, Tokhtamysh was defeated. He returned a second time, this time wounded, a broken man. He had failed. But Timur's patience was inhuman. He brought the prince into his own palace, had his personal physicians nurse him back to health, and to the astonishment of his entire court, began to assemble a third army for him. This was not generosity. It was strategy. And this time fate intervened. As Tokhtamysh prepared for his third attempt, his powerful rival, Urus Khan, suddenly died. The Golden Horde was thrown into confusion. This was the moment. Tokhtamysh, backed by Timur's veterans, swept north. He defeated Urus Khan's sons and, with relative ease, seized the throne of the eastern half of the Horde, the White Horde. But Tokhtamysh was not just a puppet. He had his own ambition. He didn't stop. He looked west, to the other half of the Golden Horde, the Blue Horde. That realm was also in chaos. Its de facto ruler, the kingmaker Mamai, had just been crushed by the Russian princes in the Great Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. Mamai's army was broken, his authority gone. Tokhtamysh, riding a wave of victory, crossed the Volga, defeated Mamai, and seized the capital city of Sarai. In a few short years, Timur's failed investment had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. His son, Tokhtamysh, had done the impossible. He had reunited the entire Golden Horde, from the borders of China to the rivers of Russia. He was now one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. To prove his new power, Tokhtamysh launched a brilliant campaign in 1382. He marched on Russia not to fight their army, but to punish their insolence. He cleverly bypassed the Russian defenses, appeared before the walls of Moscow, and burned the city to the ground, forcing the Russian princes back into submission. Back in Samarkand, Timur must have been profoundly pleased. His northern border was now guarded by a mighty emperor who owed him everything. He had a loyal friend, a grateful son, protecting his entire rear flank. He was now completely free to turn his armies south, toward the fabulous wealth of Persia, without a single worry about an attack from the north. It was the most successful geopolitical maneuver of his career, and it was about to become the single greatest mistake of his life. With the problem of the Golden Horde solved by his brilliant proxy, Tokhtamysh, Timur was finally free. He turned his gaze and his invincible war machine south to the real prize, Persia. This was the ancient, cultured, and fabulously wealthy heartland of the old Ilkhanate. And it was in total chaos, fractured into a dozen warring principalities. For Timur, it was a chessboard waiting for its master. In 1386, he launched his famous three-year campaign, which would in reality last much longer. This was not a war. It was a systematic, methodical, and brutal consolidation of an entire empire. His army, a perfect synthesis of nomadic cavalry and settled engineering, swept west. He was no longer a regional king. He was a Shahinshah, a king of kings. His conquests were textbook Timur. He would offer a city terms: submit, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will be annihilated. Many cities, knowing his reputation, submitted. But the city of Isfahan in central Iran made a fatal mistake. It first surrendered, and Timur, as promised, garrisoned it with his troops. But the proud citizens, chafing under his rule, suddenly rose up in a bloody citywide revolt, slaughtering his garrison of some 3,000 men. When the news reached Timur, his response was not one of rage. It was one of cold, mathematical logic. It was the Yasa. He returned to the city, took it by storm, and issued a chilling decree. He set a quota for his army. Every Tuman, every Mingan, had to deliver a set number of severed heads. The final, horrifying count, according to his own chroniclers, was 70,000. These heads were cemented with mud into grotesque towers and pyramids all around the city, a permanent lesson in the price of defiance. While Timur was building these monuments of terror in Persia, his son Tokhtamysh was watching from the north. Tokhtamysh was no longer a desperate refugee. He was the great Khan of the reunited Golden Horde, the most powerful ruler on the steppe. He had burned Moscow. He commanded hundreds of thousands of warriors. And he was a Genghis ID. An insidious thought began to grow in his mind, watered by the flattery of his emirs. Who was Timur? He was a commoner, a lame upstart from the Barlas tribe, a mere emir. Tokhtamysh was the true Khan, the divinely appointed successor of Genghis. Timur was just his father's servant. The power Timur had given him had made him arrogant. He began to believe that he owed his success not to Timur's armies, but to his own sacred bloodline. He also had a grievance, a pretext. He looked at Azerbaijan, a rich land of pastures and cities that Timur had just conquered. This land, Tokhtamysh declared, had historically belonged to his ancestor Joki. It was part of the Golden Horde's rightful territory. Timur, he reasoned, was not his ally. He was his rival, a thief who was stealing his inheritance. In the dead of winter, 1387, while Timur was deep in his Persian campaigns, the unthinkable happened. Tokhtamysh, the son, the protege, the puppet, cut his strings and plunged a knife deep into his master's back. It was a massive, brilliantly coordinated, two-pronged invasion. One army of the Golden Horde smashed south through the Caucasus passes, driving into Azerbaijan. But the second army, led by Tokhtamysh himself, did something far more audacious and far more insulting. It bypassed the contested territories and struck directly at the heart of Timur's empire, Mawarannahr itself. The news that reached Timur in Persia must have been apocalyptic. This was not a border raid. This was a full-scale invasion of his undefended homeland. Tokhtamysh's horde, a sea of Tatar horsemen, had crossed the frozen Sir Darya River and was now ravaging the fertile valleys, burning the villages, and slaughtering the people Timur had sworn to protect. They swept aside the small local garrisons. They laid siege to the ancient city of Bukhara, and they even reached the very gates of Timur's capital, Samarkand, the city he was pouring the wealth of the world into. Timur, the chess master, had been caught in the worst possible position. He was hundreds of miles away, his main army bogged down in a foreign campaign. He was facing a terrible choice: continue his conquest of Persia, or lose the kingdom he had started with. His reaction was immediate and decisive. He abandoned his Persian campaign. He left his newly conquered cities half digested. He gathered his Kashik, his elite, veteran bodyguard, and his fastest, toughest cavalry units. In the middle of a brutal winter, he began a desperate, forced march back east, covering hundreds of miles at a speed that defied belief. Back in Mawarannahr, Tokhtamysh was enjoying his plunder. But then his scouts brought him the terrifying news. The Iron Lame was coming. And he was coming fast. Tokhtamysh's courage, it turned out, was not as great as his ambition. He was a raider, not a conqueror. He had no desire to face the master himself in a pitched battle. He quickly gathered his vast loot, rounded up tens of thousands of slaves, and retreated, scrambling back across the frozen rivers into the safety of the northern steppe. Timur arrived in his capital to find a scene of devastation. His homeland was ravaged, his people slaughtered or enslaved, his treasury emptied. He had saved Samarkand, but he had been deeply, personally, and publicly humiliated. His son had not only betrayed him but had proven him a fool. The chessmaster had been out-led. His patient, strategic mind now focused on a single, cold objective. Tokhtamysh was no longer a son or an ally. He was a cancer, and he had to be cut out. The war for Persia was over for now. The real war, a personal war of vengeance, had just begun. The humiliation Timur felt upon returning to his ravaged homeland was profound. The chessmaster had not just been challenged. He had been made to look like a fool by his own pawn. His mind, so cold and calculating, was now consumed by a singular icy objective. Not just the defeat, but the total annihilation of Tokhtamysh. This was no longer a geopolitical rivalry. It was a personal vendetta. But Tokhtamysh was not a man in a city. He was the Khan of the Dasht-i-Kipchak, the steppe of the Kipchaks. This was an ocean of grass, a void without roads, cities, or farms. To invade it was a logistical nightmare, a form of military suicide. An army marched into the steppe, its supply line stretched, until the grass ran out, the water turned bad, and the horses starved. This was the classic Scythian defense that had defeated the Persians and humbled the Romans. Tokhtamysh, the nomadic warrior, knew this. He would simply retreat, luring Timur deeper and deeper into the endless void, until his great army starved and froze. Timur, however, was not a Roman or a Persian. He was a child of the steppe, and he was a logistical grandmaster. He understood the void, and he decided that if the void had no supplies, he would simply bring his own world with him. For over a year, he prepared. He did not just gather an army, he gathered a nation. When he finally marched north from Samarkand in early 1391, he led a force that the world had never seen. Estimates range, but it was likely close to 200,000 men. It was not an army. It was a moving city. They drove with them vast herds of sheep and cattle for food. A colossal baggage train carried grain, forges, arrows, and supplies. Timur's solution to the steppe was ingenious. He knew his army could not live off the land, so he turned the land into his supply. He organized massive, systematic hunts. His light cavalry would fan out for miles, creating a gigantic circle, and drive all living game, deer, gazelle, wild donkeys, into a central killing ground. This was not sport. It was military-grade harvesting, feeding tens of thousands. Even more astounding, during the march, he ordered his men to plant barley as they went. His plan was so long-range, he was already provisioning his return journey, intending to harvest the crops he had planted on his way out. This was the army that Timur led north. Tokhtamysh, hearing of his approach, began his great retreat. He pulled back deeper and deeper into the steppe, just as he had planned. He sent skirmishers to harass Timur's flanks, to pick off stragglers. He was confident Timur was walking into his trap. But Timur did not stop. Weeks turned into a month turned into 2. The landscape was a featureless green ocean. His men, mostly from the cities and valleys of Mawarannahr, began to despair. They were in a land their ancestors had left, a nowhere that led to the end of the world. But Timur's will was absolute. He had his spies, his scouts, and his own iron determination. He pushed on. After 5 months of this relentless, grueling pursuit, Timur's army had crossed thousands of miles. They had marched into modern-day Kazakhstan, and then north into what is now Russia. They had finally reached the frontiers of Tokhtamysh's heartland, near the Volga River. Tokhtamysh, who had been retreating all this time, was finally cornered. He had run out of steppe. His trap had failed. Timur's impossible logistics had beaten him. He had no choice left but to fight. On June 18, 1391, at the Battle of the Kondurcha River, the 2 greatest Turco-Mongol armies on earth faced each other. Tokhtamysh still commanded a massive force, and he was fighting on home terrain. He deployed his army in the classic 3-part formation: a center, a right wing, and a left wing. He was a confident, skilled nomadic commander. But Timur was a chess master. He did not play by the standard rules. He deployed his army not in 3 parts, but in 7. He had his main center, his 2 flanks, and 2 additional divisions of reserves hidden behind the flanks. He also had a powerful vanguard, and his own personal elite bodyguard held in reserve, commanded by his sons. The battle began. Tokhtamysh's right wing, his strongest force, launched a massive charge and crashed into Timur's left flank. The line buckled. Timur's emirs on that flank began to panic as the Golden Horde warriors started to envelop them. For a moment, it looked like Timur's army might break. But this was exactly the move Timur had anticipated. At the critical moment, he did not just plug the gap. He launched his counter-checkmate. He unleashed his hidden reserves. Fresh, elite, heavy cavalry who had been waiting for this moment did not just stop Tokhtamysh's charge, they slammed into its flank. At the same time, Timur's own center advanced. Tokhtamysh's charging wing, suddenly hit from the front and the side, shattered. Their momentum was broken, and they were enveloped. The collapse was instantaneous and total. The sight of his strongest wing being annihilated broke the will of the entire Golden Horde army. They turned and fled. The battle became a one-sided slaughter. Timur's men pursued the routed army for days, cutting them down by the thousands. The victory was absolute. Tokhtamysh himself, his entire army destroyed, his treasury and harem captured, barely escaped the field with a handful of followers. Timur, his honor avenged, had achieved the impossible. He had marched an army into the void and won a decisive victory. He spent weeks feasting on the banks of the Volga, his men dividing the spoils. He believed the war was over. He had taught his son a lesson he would never forget. He had broken the Golden Horde forever. But he was wrong. Timur returned from his northern campaign in 1391 as the undisputed supreme victor. He had done what no one thought possible. He had led a settled army into the heart of the steppe, forced the Khan of the Golden Horde to battle on his own terms, and annihilated his forces. As he returned to Samarkand, laden with the treasures of the Horde, he was satisfied. He had avenged his humiliation. The northern threat, he believed, was permanently neutralized. Tokhtamysh was a broken fugitive, his reputation shattered. With his northern flank secure, Timur turned his full, undivided attention back to his true great work, the total conquest of Persia and the Middle East. In 1392, he launched his 5-year campaign, a vast military operation that would cement his legacy. This was Timur at his peak. He was no longer just a regional power. He was a force of nature. His invincible machine marched west, systematically absorbing kingdom after kingdom. He crushed the rebellious dynasties in southern Iran, executing the last of their princes. He marched into Mesopotamia and seized the ancient city of Baghdad, the seat of the caliphs, forcing its ruler, Sultan Ahmad Jalayir, to flee. He pushed north into the Caucasus, waging a brutal holy war against the Christian kingdom of Georgia, leaving a trail of ruined churches and shattered fortresses. He was the master of the world. And yet, he had made one critical, fundamental miscalculation. He had understood Tokhtamysh's army, but he had not understood the steppe. He had defeated a man, but he had not defeated a system. Tokhtamysh was a ghost of the steppe. As a direct Genghis Khan, his very blood was a banner. As long as he was alive, he could ride into any nomadic camp in the vast lands of Siberia or the deep steppe, and warriors would flock to him. He was like the mythical Hydra. Timur had cut off its head, but the creature itself was still alive. And while Timur was busy in Baghdad, Tokhtamysh was doing exactly that. He had fled from the Kondurcha battlefield, a refugee once more. But he was resilient. He gathered a new army from the far-flung tribes. And he found a powerful new ally, the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, the very man whose lands Timur was now threatening. The Mamluks, terrified of Timur's advance, were happy to finance and arm his greatest rival. By 1395, 4 years after his final defeat, Tokhtamysh was back. He had a new army, and he was burning with a desperate need for revenge. He saw Timur bogged down in the mountains of the Caucasus, and he saw his chance. He launched one last desperate invasion, sweeping south into the very lands Timur was currently occupying. When the news reached Timur, it was not the shock of the first betrayal. It was the cold, hard realization of the chess master who realizes he has missed a move. He saw his mistake now. His first campaign, 1391, had been flawed. It was a war of punishment, designed to defeat an army. It had failed because the source of the Horde's power remained untouched. The Golden Horde was not just a collection of nomads. It was a vast commercial empire. Its great cities on the Volga, Sarai and Astrakhan, and its trade hubs in the Crimea like Tana were the great arteries of the Northern Silk Road. They were the source of the wealth that allowed Tokhtamysh to raise new armies. Timur now made a new vow. This would not be a war of punishment. This would be a war of annihilation. He would not just defeat Tokhtamysh. He would destroy the Golden Horde itself. He would tear out its heart, burn its cities, and permanently reroute its trade, diverting all that wealth south, through his own capital of Samarkand. On April 15, 1395, the two armies met for the last time at the Battle of the Terek River in the North Caucasus. Tokhtamysh, fighting for his survival, threw his forces into a desperate, furious assault. But Timur was not the same commander he had been. He was a master of combined arms. He had learned from his campaigns. This time, he fortified his center. He had his infantry dig trenches and create a kasar, a fortified wall of wagons chained together, with a ditch in front. When Tokhtamysh's heavy cavalry charged, they did not find an open line to break. They smashed into this fortified, immovable wall. Their charge, the great weapon of the steppe, was broken. Their momentum was lost. As they recoiled in confusion, milling in front of the wagons, Timur unleashed his trap. His elite heavy cavalry, held in reserve on the flanks, crashed into the sides of the stalled and disorganized horde. The result was a slaughter far more decisive than Kondurcha. The horde's army was not just defeated, it was vaporized. Tokhtamysh fled the field, and this time he would never return. He would spend the rest of his life as a hunted phantom, a king with no kingdom, until he was finally found and assassinated by one of his own emirs years later. But Timur was just getting started. The battle was over, but the real war, had just begun. He turned his army north and marched into the heartland of his enemy. He was no longer a general. He was an executioner. He arrived at Sarai, the magnificent capital of the Golden Horde, one of the largest and richest cities in the world. He took it, his men plundered it, and then he ordered it systematically leveled to the ground. He did the same to Tana, the great trade port on the Sea of Azov, massacring the Italian, Genoese, and Venetian merchants who ran it. He did the same to Astrakhan. He was not just destroying buildings. He was destroying an economy. He was a surgeon, cutting the great trade arteries of his rival. This single act permanently and irrevocably rerouted the main branch of the Silk Road. The northern route, through the steppe, was dead. From now on, all trade from China to Europe would be forced to go south, through Persia, through Mesopotamia, through his cities. When Timur finally turned south, he left behind a smoking ruin. The Golden Horde, the great empire that had ruled Russia for centuries, was shattered. It would never recover. It broke apart into smaller, weaker states, the Khanates of Crimea, Kazan, and Astrakhan. Timur had not just won a war, he had erased an empire from the map. After the total destruction of the Golden Horde, Timur returned to his capital, Samarkand, in 1396. He was now 60 years old. He was the undisputed master of Central Asia, Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. His great rival in the north was a hunted ghost. He had built an empire that rivaled that of Genghis Khan himself. By any normal measure, his life's work was complete. It was a time for any other ruler to rest, to consolidate, to enjoy the unimaginable wealth he had accumulated. But Timur's mind was not built for rest. The chessmaster, having cleared one side of the board, now turned his gaze to a new, untouched, and fabulously wealthy quadrant, India. The pretext, as always, was a righteous one. The rulers of the Delhi Sultanate, the Tughlaq dynasty, were Muslims. But in Timur's cold and calculating eyes, they were bad Muslims. He received reports from his spies that the sultans in Delhi were overly tolerant of their vast Hindu population. They allowed them to practice their idolatrous faith, to build temples, and to hold positions of authority. For Timur, the Ghazi, the self-proclaimed sword of Islam, this was an unforgivable sin. It was his sacred duty to march to India and punish these lax rulers. The true motive, of course, was plunder. India was not just a kingdom. It was a treasure chest. It was a land of fabled, almost mythical wealth, accumulated over centuries. The Delhi Sultanate, while immensely rich, was also politically weak, paralyzed by the same kind of internal decay and civil war that Timur so expertly exploited. It was a ripe, glittering prize, just waiting to be taken. But there was one reason why India had remained untouched by the conquerors of Central Asia. One reason why even Genghis Khan himself had turned back from its borders. Between Samarkand and Delhi lay the Hindu Kush. This was not just a range of mountains. It was a wall of the world. It was a colossal, jagged barrier of rock and ice, whose name literally meant Hindu killer. It was a place of treacherous, narrow passes, sheer cliffs, and air so thin it could barely be breathed. To move a small group of traders through it was a life-threatening ordeal. To move a 90,000-man army of heavy cavalry through it was considered a logistical impossibility. It was madness. For Timur, impossibility was just a tactical problem. In 1398, he set his great machine in motion. This campaign, more than any other, showcases his terrifying inhuman will. He did not just march his army. He disassembled it and rebuilt it on the other side. His engineers, the same men who toppled the walls of Persian cities, went first. They became a corps of mountain pioneers. They advanced into the passes, building wooden bridges over bottomless chasms, cutting new roads into the faces of cliffs, and lowering horses and siege engines on massive ropes and platforms into the valleys below. The soldiers, men from the flat plains and hot deserts of Mawarannahr, were pushed into a frozen hell. They suffered terribly from altitude sickness. Their horses, unused to the terrain, slipped and fell by the thousands into the abysses. They were beset by fierce local tribes, the Kafiristanis, who fought with a suicidal bravery in their mountain strongholds. Timur, showing no mercy, hunted them down, scaling their impregnable fortresses and slaughtering them, famously building more of his skull towers at their gates. After months of this grueling, nightmarish ordeal, a frostbitten, emaciated, but intact army emerged from the mountains and descended onto the plains of the Punjab. They had done the impossible. They had breached the wall of the world. Now the real campaign began. It was a march of pure, calculated terror. As Timur's army moved through northern India, it was like a scythe through wheat. He shattered the first armies that met him, and with every city he captured, he accumulated prisoners. Not just soldiers but civilians, men, women, and children. He was not a raider. He was a glacier, and he dragged the debris of the lands he crushed with him. By the time he reached the outskirts of Delhi, his army was herding a captive population of 100,000 people. These were not soldiers, but prisoners of war and enslaved civilians. And now this massive group of people became a military problem. They were a drag on his army. They consumed food and water. And as he prepared for the final decisive battle with the Sultan of Delhi, he began to worry. What if, in the heat of the battle, these 100,000 prisoners decided to revolt at his back? Timur, the chess master, weighed the risk. He looked at these 100,000 human beings, men, women, and children who had surrendered to him, as a liability, a weak piece on his board. And he made a cold, pragmatic decision that stands as one of the most chilling acts of his entire life. He gave a single, simple order to his emirs. All 100,000 Hindu prisoners were to be executed immediately. It was not a massacre born of rage. It was a memo. His chroniclers wrote that his soldiers, hardened veterans of his brutal campaigns, were visibly shaken. Many were pious Muslims, and the Quran forbids the slaying of captives. But the Yasa, the law of Timur, overruled the Sharia. The law of military necessity was absolute. The executions were carried out, a mass slaughter that took the better part of a day. His army's rear was now secure. His men, their hands stained with the blood of 100,000 unarmed civilians, were now ready to face the main army of the Sultan. The field before Delhi was cleared for the final game. With his rear flank secured in the most brutal way imaginable, Timur's army was now free to focus on the battle ahead. On December 17, 1398, he advanced to the plains outside the walls of Delhi. There, the army of the Sultan, Mahmud Tughlaq, was arrayed for battle. It was a large force, but Timur's spies had already given him a perfect assessment of its strengths and weaknesses. The Sultan's army was a standard, formidable force of infantry and cavalry, but it possessed one weapon that Timur's men had never faced before. It was a weapon designed to inspire pure terror and to shatter the lines of any conventional army. Lumbering in front of the Indian lines were 120 war elephants. These were not just animals. They were armored, mobile fortresses. They were clad in chainmail. Their tusks were tipped with poisoned iron daggers. Their backs carried howdahs, or small castles, packed with archers and spearmen. To the Turco-Mongol horsemen, these creatures were monsters from a nightmare. Their horses, smelling the alien scent of the elephants, became wild-eyed with panic, threatening to bolt before the battle even began. The Sultan's entire strategy was built on this one move: a massive, irresistible elephant charge that would punch through Timur's center, create mass panic, and allow his cavalry to sweep in and destroy the disorganized survivors. Timur, the chessmaster, calmly studied this new terrifying piece on the board. He understood that you do not fight terror with conventional force. You fight it with superior cunning and even greater terror. He devised a plan that was as bizarre as it was brilliant. First, he addressed the physical threat. He ordered his men to dig a large, wide trench in front of his own lines, partially concealed. This would serve as a barrier, disrupting the elephants' charge and breaking their momentum. Second, he addressed the psychological threat, the panic of his own horses. He turned to the creature his army knew best, the camel. He had a large corps of dromedary camels in his baggage train, used for transport. He ordered his engineers to build large wooden structures, like saddles, and strap them to the backs of several hundred of these camels. Then they were to load these wooden saddles with a specific flammable mixture: dry hay, bundles of sticks, and pots of oil and pitch. His line was set. The trench was dug. His cavalry was massed on the flanks, and his camel corps was hidden in the center. The battle began. The Indian army advanced, with the 120 armored elephants leading the charge. The ground shook. The Sultan's trumpets blared. This was the moment that was supposed to win the war, the moment Timur's army was supposed to break and flee in terror. As the elephants picked up speed and began their unstoppable-looking charge, Timur gave his own strange order. The camel corps advanced. When they were within range, his men lit the hay and pitch on their backs. The camels, in an instant, became living, screaming fireballs. Driven mad by the fire on their own backs, they were spurred forward, charging directly at the line of advancing elephants. The result was an instantaneous, apocalyptic collision of terrors. The elephants, for all their training, were still animals. They were suddenly confronted with a nightmare they could not process. Dozens of screaming, blazing creatures running at them. The smell of fire, the shrieks of the camels, and the sight of the flames caused a mass, uncontrollable panic. The war elephants, the great unbreakable weapon of India, stopped dead in their tracks, reared up in terror, and did the one thing the Sultan had not anticipated. They turned around. They charged in a blind panic backwards, stampeding directly into their own Indian infantry lines. The unbreakable weapon had just shattered its own army. The Indian lines dissolved into pure chaos. The elephants, blinded by fear, trampled thousands of their own soldiers. The formations collapsed. The army's center ceased to exist. Timur, watching from his command post, saw the checkmate. He unleashed his cavalry. His heavy horsemen, who had been waiting on the flanks, now charged into the disorganized, panicked, and elephant-trampled masses. The battle was over before it had truly begun. It was not a fight. It was a one-sided slaughter. The Sultan of Delhi's army was annihilated. The Sultan himself fled the city, abandoning his capital and his people to their fate. A few days later, on December 18th, Timur entered the great city of Delhi, the richest city in India, as its undisputed master. He had conquered India. The entry into Delhi was, at first, an orderly affair. This was Timur's method. He was not a chaotic barbarian. He was a systematic extortionist. He accepted the formal surrender of the city's leaders, rode to the great mosque to give thanks to God for his victory, and then presented his terms: an enormous indemnity, a ransom to be paid by the citizens in exchange for sparing their lives. The city's elite, terrified, agreed. They began to collect the vast sums of gold, silver, and jewels that Timur demanded. But a city of hundreds of thousands of people, filled with the triumphant, heavily armed soldiers of an invading army, is a tinderbox. And Timur's soldiers were like a pack of starving wolves let loose in a banquet hall. They were men from the harsh, dry steppes, and they were now in the richest city they had ever dreamed of. The order broke down almost immediately. Soldiers, ostensibly to collect the indemnity, began to enter wealthy homes, harassing the population, searching for hidden treasures, and taking food and wine. The citizens of Delhi, a proud and warlike people, began to resist. Fights broke out in the markets. A skirmish in one of the city's great gates escalated. A group of citizens, in a fit of desperate courage, attacked and killed a detachment of Timur's troops. The news was brought to Timur. This was the treachery he had been waiting for. It was the broken promise that, in his mind, invalidated any agreement to spare the city. It was the legal and moral justification he needed, under his own code, to do what he had likely intended to do all along. He gave the order. He unleashed his army. What followed was not a battle. It was one of the most horrific and systematic massacres in the history of the Indian subcontinent. It was not a chaotic riot. It was a planned 3-day butchering, with the city's different quarters assigned to his various emirs for processing. His Turco-Mongol warriors, now given free rein, swarmed through the gates. For 3 days and 3 nights, the city was given over to plunder, fire, and slaughter. The citizens fought back, barricading their homes, but they were no match for the battle-hardened professionals. The army moved from street to street, house to house, killing and then killing more. The chroniclers, including Timur's own, described the scene in apocalyptic terms. The streets ran with blood. The city was set ablaze, and a great column of smoke blotted out the sun for days. The Hindu population was shown no mercy. Timur, the Ghazi, was performing his holy work. His men hunted them down. Thousands of people, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, enacted their own terrible rite of Jauhar. The men killed their own wives and children, set their homes on fire, and then charged out naked to meet their own deaths. Timur, as he had done in Isfahan, built towers of their severed heads as another grisly monument to his victory. When the 3 days were over, the city of Delhi was a silent, smoking charnel house, its population almost entirely exterminated. The blood. Now for the diamonds. The plunder was beyond comprehension. The loot was so vast it is almost impossible to describe. His army, which had marched into India, was now a treasury on the move. They had stripped the city bare. For centuries, the sultans of Delhi had been hoarding the wealth of India. Gold, silver, pearls, and most famously, rubies and diamonds from the legendary Golconda mines. Now all of it belonged to Timur. His chronicler, Rui Gonzalez de Clavijo, who would visit his court years later, wrote that every single soldier in the army, down to the lowest groom, had become a rich man. They had taken so much gold and silver that it ceased to be counted. They had taken so many gems that they were carried in sacks, like grain. Soldiers who knew nothing of value were seen toying with rubies and diamonds the size of pigeons' eggs. Timur himself claimed the most valuable treasures: the personal treasury of the Sultan, the rarest gems, and the most sacred religious objects. The sheer weight of the gold and jewels was so great that it required thousands of captured camels and horses to carry it. But Timur plundered more than just treasure. He plundered talent. This was his other, equally important objective. He was not just a destroyer. He was a collector. He had a vision for his own capital, Samarkand. He wanted to make it the most beautiful city in the world, the Rome of the East. And to do so, he needed the world's best craftsmen. He had rounded up the 100,000 prisoners. Now, from the ruins of Delhi, he rounded up thousands more. But this was a selective plunder. He identified every skilled artisan in the city. The master stonemasons, the architects who knew how to build India's unique arches and domes, the sculptors, the calligraphers, the armorers. All of them, thousands of men and their families, were chained together and marched out of their ruined city. They were now the property of the emir, destined to be taken on the long, brutal march back over the Hindu Kush to build the palaces and mosques of Samarkand. In early 1399, Timur's work in India was done. He was not interested in governing India. He had no intention of adding it to his empire. He was a raider on a colossal civilizational scale. He had come for two things: to make a statement of terror and to acquire wealth and talent. He had succeeded on all counts. He assembled his vast army, his endless train of treasure-laden camels, and his new herd of captured artisans. And as quickly as he had come, he turned his army around and marched back north, leaving a shattered, burning, and depopulated Delhi behind him. The Delhi Sultanate would never recover. For nearly a century, it would remain a broken minor state, a ghost of its former glory. Timur, the Iron Lame, had simply ripped the heart out of a civilization and taken it home with him. In 1399, Timur returned to Samarkand from India. He was 63 years old, an age when other kings would be contemplating their succession. But Timur was not contemplating rest. He was presiding over the transformation of his capital. The tens of thousands of craftsmen, masons, and architects he had forcibly taken from Delhi, combined with those he had taken from Persia and Baghdad, were now hard at work. Samarkand was becoming the wonder of the world, a new city of turquoise domes, towering minarets, and colossal mosques, all built from the plundered wealth and talent of a dozen dead kingdoms. Timur was at the absolute zenith of his power. The chessmaster looked at his board. To the north, the Golden Horde was not just defeated. It was erased, its trade routes permanently rerouted through his own lands. To the southeast, the Delhi Sultanate was a smoking, depopulated ruin, its treasury emptied into his vaults. To the south and west, all of Persia and Mesopotamia were under his heel. His gaze and his ambition now settled on the only quadrant that remained, the far west. But this was not a fractured land of petty emirs, nor a weak and decadent sultanate. For the first time, as Timur looked west, he saw a mirror. He saw an empire as new, as aggressive, as disciplined, and as successful as his own. This was the rising star of the Ottoman Turks, and at its head was a man who was, in every way, Timur's equal. His name was Sultan Bayezid I. Bayezid was not a man to be underestimated. He was not a decadent king. He was a pure warrior, a man forged in the same fires of relentless campaigning as Timur himself. His own soldiers had given him a nickname, Yildirim, or the Lightning. He had earned it because of the astonishing, almost supernatural speed of his campaigns. He would crush a rebellion in the Balkans and then, seemingly days later, appear with his army in eastern Anatolia, moving faster than news of his own arrival. Like Timur, Bayezid was a brilliant general. Like Timur, he was a builder of a new and terrifyingly effective army. While Timur had his Turco-Mongol cavalry, Bayezid had perfected a new and unstoppable force, the Janissaries. These were slave soldiers, taken as boys from Christian families, raised with no loyalty but to the Sultan himself. They were the first and perhaps greatest professional standing army in the world, a corps of infantry so disciplined and fanatically loyal that they simply did not break in battle. And Bayezid, like Timur, saw himself as the sword of Islam. But Bayezid had a claim to this title that even Timur could not match. While Timur had spent most of his life fighting other Muslims, the Chagatai, the Persians, the Golden Horde, or plundering India, Bayezid had spent his entire reign fighting the Christians. He was the undisputed Ghazi, the holy warrior of the Sunni world. His resume was terrifying. He had conquered Bulgaria and Serbia. He had turned the rulers of the Balkans into his loyal vassals. And in 1396, while Timur was busy in the Caucasus, Bayezid had met his greatest test. The Pope in Rome had called for a massive pan-European crusade to throw the Turks out of Europe. The knights of France, Germany, Hungary, and all of Christendom had assembled into a glittering, invincible army. At the Battle of Nicopolis on the Danube, Bayezid the Lightning had not just defeated them, he had annihilated them. He had crushed the greatest army Christian Europe could produce, capturing thousands of high-born knights and executing them. The victory at Nicopolis sent a shockwave through the world. Christendom was terrified. The Islamic world was ecstatic. Sultan Bayezid was the new hero of the faith. And at the time of Timur's return from India, Bayezid was engaged in his own great work. He was laying siege to the ultimate prize, the ancient golden city of Constantinople, the 1,000-year-old capital of the Byzantine Empire. Its fall was considered imminent. These were the two men who now dominated the world, the two poles of power. Both were Turks. Both were Sunni Muslims. Both were military geniuses. Both were empire builders. And their new empires were now touching. A collision was inevitable. The world was simply not big enough for both of them. The flashpoint, as always, was a buffer zone. The small Turkish principalities, or beyliks, in eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, were being squeezed between these two titans. Bayezid, in his quest to unite all of Anatolia, had been conquering them one by one. The problem: these emirs, defeated and landless, were fleeing east and taking refuge at the court of Timur. They came to Samarkand and begged the great emir to restore them to their rightful lands. At the exact same time, Timur's own enemies were fleeing west. The Sultan of Baghdad, Ahmad Jalil, the man Timur had chased out of Mesopotamia, had fled to the one man strong enough to protect him: Sultan Bayezid. The chessboard was now set for the final game. Each ruler was harboring the mortal enemies of the other. For Timur, Bayezid was an arrogant newcomer, a minor sultan who was daring to absorb lands that Timur saw as part of his own sphere of influence. For Bayezid, Timur was a barbarian from the steppes, a Tatar who was only famous for killing other Muslims, and who had no business interfering in the affairs of the civilized West. The two greatest egos of their age were now on a direct collision course. The board was set. The two most powerful men in the world were now staring each other down. But Timur, the patient chessmaster, did not make the obvious move. He did not immediately strike at Bayezid. He knew that Bayezid had powerful allies, chiefly the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, who were just as afraid of Timur as he was. A grandmaster does not attack the enemy king while his queen and rooks are still protecting him. He first clears the board. In 1399, Timur launched his final Great Western Campaign, which would become known as the 7-Year Campaign. And its first target was not Bayezid, it was Bayezid's allies. His army, fresh from the plunder of India, was now unleashed on the Middle East. It was a calculated campaign to surgically remove Bayezid's entire support system. He marched into Mamluk-controlled Syria. The city of Aleppo, which dared to resist, was met with his classic horrific signature, a new monument of 20,000 skulls. He then marched on Damascus, one of the most sacred and ancient cities in the Islamic world. The city surrendered but was nonetheless sacked, and in a fire that raged for days, its great Umayyad mosque, one of the wonders of the world, was gutted. The Mamluk Sultanate, seeing this devastation, was paralyzed by terror. They were broken. They would not be coming to Bayezid's aid. With Syria neutralized, he swung his army east and marched on Baghdad. His old enemy, Sultan Ahmad Jalil, the man Bayezid was protecting, had foolishly returned. Timur took the city by storm one last time, and this time he showed no mercy at all. He ordered another one of his terrible quotas. Every soldier was to bring him ahead. 90,000 people were slaughtered. The city of Baghdad, the ancient capital of the caliphs, was effectively erased from the map. Bayezid's flanks were now clear. His allies were either dead or cowering. The board was finally open. It was now just king versus king. And now, the war of letters began. This was not a negotiation. It was a psychological duel, a public contest of pure ego, broadcast for the entire world to see. Timur, as the senior ruler and the self-proclaimed Lord of the Age, wrote first. His tone was one of absolute cold superiority. He was the Emir of the world, the successor to the Mongol Khans. Bayezid was, in his eyes, a mere upstart, a minor Turkmen chieftain who had gotten lucky. His letters were a list of non-negotiable demands, wrapped in condescending insults. "You are but a ruler of Turkmen," he wrote, "while I am the master of the world, from the rivers of China to the Black Sea." He demanded that Bayezid stop his aggression, that he return the lands he had taken from Timur's allies, and most importantly, that he hand over Timur's enemies, like Ahmad Jalayir, in chains. He finished with a cold threat. "Do not force me to come to you." A war between two Muslim rulers is a catastrophe for the faith, a catastrophe for which you will be held responsible by God. Bayezid, the Lightning, was not a man to be threatened. He was at the peak of his power, the hero of the entire Sunni world, the man who had crushed the United Knights of Christendom. He saw Timur as a lame barbarian, a Tatar, who had built his entire reputation on slaughtering other Muslims. His reply was pure, unadulterated fire. "Who are you, you lame ant, to address the Sultan of the Ghazi?" He wrote back. "How dare you speak to the one who has spent his life fighting the infidel, while you have only known how to murder your fellow believers? My glorious janissaries are the soldiers of God. If you value your life, you will retreat. If you dare to come west, you will find your end at their hands, and your own lands will be forfeit." The exchange escalated. It became deeply, unforgivably personal. According to the chroniclers, they ceased to be rulers and became street fighters. They attacked each other's honor. Timur mocked Bayezid's origins. Bayezid mocked Timur's physical deformity. And then they crossed the final line. They began to insult each other's wives and harems, with Timur allegedly threatening to take Bayezid's wives for his own. In the honor-bound culture of the 14th century, this was the ultimate unforgivable offense. It was a blood oath of war. There was no turning back. This was no longer about territory or refugees. It was a personal duel for the title of the most powerful man on earth. One of them had to be destroyed. In 1402, the war was on. Bayezid, furious and supremely confident, abandoned his great siege of Constantinople. He gathered his entire massive army, his unstoppable janissaries, his Serbian heavy cavalry, his Turkish forces, and marched east into Anatolia to meet this lame ant and destroy him. He was waiting for Timur to invade from the southeast. But Timur, the chessmaster, made a final brutal opening move. He did not take the obvious route. Instead, he made a lightning-fast march to the Ottoman city of Shivas. He took the fortress with terrifying speed. The defenders, mostly Armenian Christians in Bayezid's service, surrendered on a promise that no blood would be shed. Timur, in a display of his horrifyingly literal cunning, kept his promise. He had all 4,000 soldiers buried alive. It was his final gruesome message to Bayezid. A check before the checkmate. The great game was about to begin. Bayezid, the Lightning, was enraged. The news of the 4,000 soldiers buried alive at Shivas was more than a strategic loss. It was a grotesque personal insult. His supreme confidence, born from the total destruction of the European knights at Nicopolis, was now a white-hot fury. He gathered his vast army, his elite battle-hardened janissaries, his formidable Serbian heavy cavalry led by their Knight King Stefan Lazarevic, and his Anatolian Turkish forces, and marched east at his famously rapid lightning pace. He was not just marching to war, he was marching to an execution. He was going to find this lame Tatar and crush him. He arrived at Shivas, the site of the massacre. But Timur was not there. Bayezid's scouts fanned out, searching for the enemy. They were nowhere to be found. Had the ant been frightened by the Sultan's approach? Had he retreated? Bayezid, following the reports, pushed his army on, deeper into Anatolia. But Timur was not retreating. He was playing a different game. He was not a brawler. He was a grandmaster. And he had just laid the most brilliant and diabolical trap of his entire career. While Bayezid was charging east, expecting a head-on collision, Timur had done something unthinkable. He had taken his entire massive army, perhaps 140,000 men, including his Indian war elephants, on a long, grueling, secret march. He swung his army wide to the south, moving through the countryside, completely undetected. He marched past Bayezid's army, which was moving in the opposite direction. He was not moving towards Bayezid. He was moving around him. He was getting behind him. Timur's objective was a city called Ankara. Bayezid, in his blind fury, had left it undefended. In late July 1402, Timur's army arrived at Ankara. It was the middle of a brutal, parched summer. The Anatolian plain was a sun-baked desert. Timur, the logistical genius, seized the high ground. But he also seized something infinitely more important. He seized the water. His army took control of the entire length of the small Kubik River, the only significant source of fresh water for miles in any direction. He then diverted the stream, channeling it into a reservoir for his own army, and leaving the riverbed below him a dry, muddy trickle. His army, fresh and with full waterskins, rested. His men, his horses, and his 32 war elephants were positioned on the high ground, waiting. The trap was set. Bayezid, still deep in enemy territory, finally got the news. And it must have hit him like a physical blow. Timur was not in front of him. He was behind him, besieging one of his major cities, and worse, sitting between Bayezid and his own homelands. The lightning had been outmaneuvered. He was now the one who was trapped. He had no choice. He had to turn his army around. In the blistering summer heat, he forced-marched his men back, a long, grueling journey over the same dry plains. When his army finally arrived at the field of Ankara on July 20th, 1402, they were not a fresh army ready for battle. They were a column of exhausted, dusty men, dying of thirst. And they looked up, and they saw Timur's nightmare. The lame ant was waiting for him. His army was perfectly arrayed on the high ground. And, worst of all, they were holding the water. Bayezid's men, their tongues swelling, could see the water their enemy was camped beside. Timur had just checkmated him. Bayezid, the great sultan, had been forced into the one position a general must never accept. He was forced to fight a battle he did not want, on ground he did not choose, at a time he did not pick, in a condition of mortal weakness. But he had no choice. If he waited, his army would dissolve from thirst. He had to attack. He launched his army in a desperate uphill charge. His Serbian knights, bound by an oath of loyalty, fought with their famous suicidal courage. His Janissaries, the supposedly unbeatable soldiers of God, advanced with grim discipline. The battle was a horrific, grinding affair in the dust and heat. But Timur had one more move to play. He had not just been scouting the terrain. He had been scouting his enemy. His spies had been at work for months. He knew that Bayezid's army was not a monolith. It contained tens of thousands of Anatolian Turkish soldiers, men from the principalities, the beyliks, that Bayezid had forcibly conquered. Their emirs were serving Bayezid, but they hated him. And they had been in secret contact with Timur, a man they saw as a fellow Turco-Mongol, a restorer of old traditions. At the height of the battle, as the Serbian knights and janissaries were locked in a death struggle, Timur gave the signal, and the entire left flank of the Ottoman army simply dissolved. The Anatolian troops did not just flee. They switched sides. They turned their banners and began to attack their own army from the rear. It was the ultimate betrayal. It was the final checkmate move. The Ottoman army attacked from the front, from the flank, and now from behind simply ceased to exist. It collapsed into a total panicked rout. The Serbian knights were cut down. The janissaries, loyal to the last, formed a protective ring around their sultan on a small hill, but they were overwhelmed, killed one by one. Bayezid the Lightning, the hero of Nicopolis, the terror of Europe, the man who was about to take Constantinople, saw his entire empire evaporate in a single afternoon. He tried to flee on his fast stallion, but he was recognized, hunted down, and dragged from his horse. He was brought as a captive, covered in dust and sweat, and thrown at the feet of the lame ant he had so profoundly underestimated. The chess game was over. The battle was over. The field of Ankara was a graveyard for the Ottoman army. And Bayezid, the Lightning, the Sultan of the Ottomans, the hero of Nicopolis, was a captive. He was brought, covered in the dust and shame of his defeat, to Timur's imperial tent. The chroniclers who later recorded this meeting described a scene of immense, quiet drama. The two most powerful men on earth, who had insulted each other's wives and honor, were now face to face. Timur, the victor, was not rage-filled. He was the cold, calculating chessmaster who had just won the game. He was, by all accounts, correct. He did not mock or torture his fallen rival. Instead, he employed a far more potent and cruel weapon: magnanimity. He allegedly had Bayezid unbound. He seated him, perhaps even beside him. He spoke to him with a kind of cold, formal courtesy, monarch to monarch. He is even said to have reminded Bayezid of their shared Turco-Mongol heritage, lamenting the tragedy that God had forced two such great Muslim rulers to shed blood. This kindness was the ultimate humiliation. It was the calm, detached superiority of the master speaking to the broken fool. Timur had proven his point. Bayezid, who had called him a lame ant, was now a guest in his tent. His life and his empire held in the palm of that ant's hand. What followed was not a quick execution. Timur understood the power of symbols. Bayezid was his ultimate trophy, the living proof of his supremacy. He would not be killed. He would be displayed. As Timur's army turned west to systematically dismantle the rest of the Ottoman Empire, Bayezid was forced to join the baggage train. He was made to follow, day after day, as Timur's army marched through his own kingdom. He was forced to watch as Timur's men plundered his cities, tore down his fortresses, and undid a lifetime's work of conquest. This was the true psychological torture. But it is what happened next that would become one of the most famous and disputed stories in history: the legend of the Iron Cage. The story, which spread like wildfire across Europe and the Middle East, was horrific. It claimed that Timur, in an act of barbaric cruelty, had locked Bayezid in a portable iron cage, like a captured exotic beast. He allegedly dragged this cage with his army, displaying the Sultan to his troops and to the cities he passed. The story only grew more lurid in the telling. It was said that Timur used the caged Sultan as a footstool, placing his foot on his rival's back to mount his horse. It was said that Bayezid's wife was forced to serve Timur's court, naked at his banquets, while her husband watched, powerless from his cage. This image, the mighty Sultan in a cage, became the defining symbol of Timur's barbarism in the West. It was the ultimate tale of hubris and humiliation, of how the mighty had fallen. But was it true? Almost certainly not. It was a masterpiece of propaganda and most likely a simple mistranslation. The truth is more complex. The story was spread by Timur's enemies, by Arab and Turkish chroniclers who wanted to paint him as an inhuman monster, a godless barbarian from the steppes. It served their purpose to show him as savage and depraved. The most likely origin of the myth, however, is a linguistic one. As a captive king, Bayezid was a high-value prisoner. He had to be transported securely. He was likely carried in a kafas, a Turkish word for a covered litter, or a sedan chair. These litters, used for high-status individuals, were often latticed or barred with wood or metal to allow air in while keeping the occupant secure. It is easy to see what happened. A chronicler, hearing that the Sultan was being transported in a barred kafas, translated this with hostile intent into the far more sensational iron cage. The story was simply too good, too powerful, and too symbolic to be questioned. It stuck. The footstool and the humiliation of his wife were almost certainly later embellishments, designed to amplify the horror. But here is the crucial fact. Even if the literal iron cage was a myth, the metaphor was entirely true. Bayezid was a prisoner. He was Timur's trophy. He was caged, his every move watched, his will broken. He had lost everything. The end came quickly. Bayezid, the Lightning, was a man of colossal, ferocious pride. He was the man who had defeated all of Christendom. He could not endure this. He could not live as a symbol of his own failure. He fell into a deep, dark despair. For 8 months, he was dragged in the wake of Timur's triumphant army. His health, both physical and mental, collapsed. In March of 1403, near the city of Aksahir, Bayezid I, the fourth Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, died in captivity. He was only 42 years old. The official cause was apoplexy, a massive stroke brought on by his profound depression, rage, and humiliation. A Turkish legend, perhaps more fitting for his character, insists that he took his own life, swallowing a vial of poison he had hidden in his ring, choosing death over a life of dishonor. Timur had not just defeated his rival. He had utterly broken him body and soul. The greatest champion of the Islamic West was dead, a prisoner in a layman's camp. Timur now stood as the undisputed, sole and terrifying master of the known world. His greatest rival, Bayezid, was dead. The Ottoman army was a ghost. But the chess master's game was not finished. He had not come all this way just to win a single battle. He had come to reorder the world. He would ensure that the Ottoman Empire, this rival power, would not just be defeated, it would be dismantled. He turned his army west and marched, unopposed, through the heart of Anatolia. This was no longer a campaign. It was a victory lap, a systematic assertion of his total authority. His armies marched all the way to the coast of the Aegean Sea, the very frontier of Europe. He had reached the edge of the Western world. To prove that no one, not even the Christian knights of the West, was beyond his reach, he did something symbolic. He marched to the coastal fortress of Smyrna, modern-day Izmir. This was the last formidable stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller in Asia, a fortress that Bayezid himself had besieged, unsuccessfully, for years. Timur, with his scientific corps of engineers and sappers, took it in 2 weeks, slaughtered its infidel defenders, and added their heads to his towers. But his most important move was political, not military. It was a move of pure strategic genius, designed to ensure the Ottomans stayed broken. He did not claim Anatolia for himself. Instead, he summoned the emirs of all the old Turkish principalities, the beyliks, the very men Bayezid had spent his life conquering. Timur gifted them their lands back. He restored their independence. With a single decree, he undid a generation of Ottoman conquest. He did not just defeat the Ottoman Empire. He disassembled it, piece by piece, like a complex machine. Then, He released Bayezid's sons. He knew that in the power vacuum, they would not unite. They would, like wolves, tear each other apart for the scraps of their father's broken kingdom. And that is exactly what happened. The moment Timur turned his back, the Ottoman state collapsed into a brutal decade-long civil war known as the Fetret Devri, or the Ottoman Interregnum. The sons of Bayezid fought each other with a ferocity that finished the job Timur had started. Timur had not just defeated his rival. He had erased him from the board and set the remaining pieces to destroy each other. But as this was happening, a profound and unintended consequence was rippling across the other side of the world. In the great cities of Christian Europe, in Venice, Genoa, Paris, London, and most of all, Constantinople, news of the Battle of Ankara arrived. And it was met not with fear, but with a shock of profound, disbelieving relief. For years, all of Christendom had been living in the terrifying shadow of Bayezid, the Lightning. He had crushed their greatest crusade at Nicopolis. And at the very moment Timur attacked him, Bayezid's armies were at the gates of Constantinople, the 1,000-year-old capital of the Byzantine Empire. The city was starving. It was on its last legs. Its fall was not a question of if, but when. The Emperor Manuel II Palaeologos was on a desperate, humiliating tour of Europe, begging the kings of France and England for soldiers that would never come. And then, like a miracle, a deus ex machina, Bayezid was gone. His army had vanished. The siege was lifted. A lame Tatar from the unknown east had, in a single afternoon, done what all the knights of Christendom could not. He had saved them. The reaction was immediate. The barbarian who had built skull towers in Isfahan and buried men alive in Shivas was suddenly, in the courts of Europe, the most celebrated man in the world. He was the great Tamerlane, a noble and powerful prince. The Byzantine emperor, overwhelmed with gratitude, immediately sent tribute to Timur, acknowledging him as his supreme master and de facto lord. The kings of the West, who had once dreaded Bayezid, now saw Timur as a potential ally, a great second front against the Turk. The King of France sent an embassy. The King of England, Henry IV, sent his congratulations. The most famous embassy came from the King of Castile in Spain, who sent his envoy Ruy González de Clavijo on a long, perilous journey to Timur's court. Clavijo would later write one of the most famous travelogues in history, describing the almost unimaginable power and splendor of Timur's court in Samarkand. This was the ultimate irony of Timur's career. This man, who was a devout Muslim, a self-proclaimed Ghazi, and a butcher of Christians in Georgia and Smyrna, was being celebrated in the churches of Europe. He had no interest in saving Christendom. He had no love for the Byzantine emperor. He had been clearing a rival from his chessboard. But in doing so, he had, completely by accident, extended the life of the Byzantine Empire. He had given them a 50-year reprieve. Without the Battle of Ankara in 1402, the city of Constantinople would have fallen, and the Ottoman conquest of Europe would have begun half a century earlier. Timur, the scourge of God, had become the accidental savior of Europe. In 1404, Timur, now 68 years old, returned to his capital of Samarkand. He was no longer just an emir. He was, in all but name, the emperor of the world. He was the master of a domain that stretched from the frontiers of China to the shores of the Aegean Sea. The embassies from the kings of Europe, like Ruy González de Clavijo of Castile, were already on their long, arduous journey to his court, coming to pay homage to the man who had saved them. And as these envoys and all of history looked upon his life's work, they were confronted with the central, defining, and most profound paradox of his entire existence. For history has not left us with one Tamerlane, but two. The first Tamerlane is the one known to the wider world, to Persia, to India, to Russia, to Georgia, and to the Ottoman Empire. This is Timur the Destroyer, the Scourge of God, the Lord of Terror. This is the man who, in his 35-year reign of constant warfare, had laid waste to more of the civilized world than perhaps any other human being in history. His campaigns were not just wars. They were demographic catastrophes. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon soberly estimated that Timur's conquests were responsible for the deaths of 17 million people. While this number is impossible to verify, it represents a staggering 5% of the entire world's population at the time. This is the man of the skull towers, the man who buried men alive, the butcher of Delhi, the executioner of Isfahan. This is the Tamerlane of blood and iron. But there is a second Tamerlane. This is the Tamerlane known to his capital, Samarkand. This is Timur the patron, the great builder, the lover of art, the champion of architecture, the man who presided over the birth of a new cultural golden age. This is the man who would sit for hours with scholars, debating fine points of theology, and who would argue with his own architects over the precise shade of a turquoise tile. How can these two men be the same person? The answer is the key to his mind. They were not separate. They were two parts of a single, terrible, and deliberate policy. The destruction and the creation were not contradictory. One was the engine for the other. Timur was not a mindless barbarian who burned for the sake of burning. He was a collector. He was a man with a singular obsessive vision: to make his capital, Samarkand, the undisputed center of the world, the Pearl of the East. And he had decided on a simple, brutal method to achieve this. If the world's talent and beauty would not come to Samarkand, he would drag it there. He treated the great cities of the world as his personal quarries. But he was not quarrying for stone. He was quarrying for talent. His policy was a cold, systematic harvest of human capital. When his army took a city, a terrible sorting process began. The general population, the merchants, the farmers, the common laborers, were a liability. They were, in his cold calculation, mouths to feed and potential rebels. They were often slaughtered. But the city's artisans, they were a priceless asset. They were the city's soul. And he would rip that soul out and take it for himself. Before his armies even attacked, his spies, the same men who mapped the walls, were also mapping the talent. They knew which neighborhoods held the finest silk weavers, which masters built the best astrolabes, which calligraphers wrote the most beautiful script. When Damascus fell, he rounded up the finest armorers in the world, the men who knew the secret of Damascus steel, and he marched them to Samarkand. When he took Isfahan and Shiraz, he captured the master tilemakers and mosaic artists, the men who knew how to create that perfect luminous Persian blue. When he sacked Delhi, he enslaved thousands of India's master stone masons, the only men in the world who knew the secrets of Hindu architecture, how to build their unique domes and arches. From Baghdad, he took the scholars. From Anatolia, the silversmiths. These were not happy immigrants. They were a captive population. They were chained together and marched thousands of miles across deserts and over mountains in a vast tragic migration of talent. They were brought to his pet project, his capital city. This was Timur's grand economic and cultural idea. He was not just plundering gold and jewels. Gold is finite. He was plundering knowledge. He was plundering the means of production. He deliberately and systematically drained the rest of the world of its artistic genius and concentrated it all in one single over-caffeinated city. He was creating an artistic supernova by stealing the light from every other star in the sky. The towers of skulls in Persia were not just an act of terror. They were the price he was willing to pay for the great turquoise domes of Samarkand. The blood he spilled in India was the ink he used to write a new chapter of art in his homeland. The destroyer and the creator were one and the same. And the result of this terrible parasitic policy was the most beautiful city on earth. The embassies, like the one led by Rui González de Clavijo of Spain, made the long and perilous journey east. They traveled for months, crossing the lands Timur had conquered. The ruins of Anatolia, the depopulated plains of Persia. They saw a world of desolation, of burnt cities and fallow fields, a world bled dry by his armies. And then, after thousands of miles, they crossed the river Oxus and entered Mawarannahr. They rose over a final pass, and they saw it. It was a vision, an illusion rising from the dry, brown dust of the steppe. It was Samarkand. To the visitors, it was a profound shock. They had traveled through a graveyard, and they had arrived in paradise. The city was an explosion of color, a forest of towering minarets, and above all, the brilliant luminous turquoise and azure blue of its colossal domes. This was the Pearl of the East, the city Timur had built, and it was designed to do one thing: to overwhelm. It was a statement of power, a city built to awe the world into submission. This was the city built by the captive artisans. The master stonecutters from Delhi had been put to work. The mosaic artists from Shiraz, the architects from Isfahan, the calligraphers from Baghdad, this was their great forced labor project. And the result was an architectural style the world had never seen, a fusion of Persian elegance, Indian scale, and Mongol ambition. When Clavijo and other envoys entered the city, they were in a world capital. The streets were not just filled with Timur's people. They were a mandatory congress of all nations. The bazaars were a babel of tongues, where you could hear Chinese, Hindi, Arabic, Persian, Turkic, and Russian. It was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city on earth, but it was a cosmopolitanism of conquest. The heart of the city was a testament to this new, brutal grandeur. Timur, in his 60s, was building on a scale that defied sanity. His masterpiece was the Great Congregational Mosque, which we now know as the Bibi Khana Mosque. It was conceived as the largest mosque in the entire Islamic world. Its gateway was so vast it dwarfed everything around it. Its great dome, covered in turquoise tiles, was intended to rival the sky itself. In the courtyard, he placed a colossal marble lectern, built to hold a Quran so large that a man had to stand on a platform to read from it. The legend, perhaps true, was that it was a race against time. Timur, impatient and obsessive, would be carried to the construction site, throwing gold and silver to the workmen to make them build faster. He would overrule his own architects, demanding they build the arches higher, the dome wider, than the laws of physics would allow. The building was a magnificent, terrifying expression of his own ego. It was beautiful, but it was built with such haste and arrogance that it began to crumble before it was even finished, a perfect metaphor for the empire he had built. Nearby, the avenue of the Shari Zinda, or Tomb of the Living King, was becoming a glittering street of the dead. It was a long, narrow alleyway of mausoleums for his family and his favorite generals, each one a breathtaking experiment in ceramic art, covered from top to bottom in the most intricate luminous blue tilework. But the city itself was not even the main event. Timur, true to his nomadic roots, despised living inside the cramped, walled city. He built his true palaces outside, in a series of vast, sprawling pleasure gardens that ringed Samarkand like a green crown. Each was a paradise on earth, filled with reflecting pools, fruit orchards, and pavilions made of silk and gold. He gave them names like Bagi Behesht, Garden of Heaven, and Bagi Iram, Garden of Paradise. It was in one of these gardens that Clavijo was finally received by the great Emir. He was not led into a dark throne room. He was led into a vast open-air tent of crimson silk, embroidered with gold and studded with gems. And there, on a low dais, sat the master of the world. Clavijo, in his famous journal, described him, not as a barbarian, but as a figure of immense, cold majesty. He was old, his skin weathered, his lame leg resting on a cushion. His eyes, though, were full of fire. He was surrounded by his court, his scholars, and his chess partners. This was the Tamerlane paradox, made real. The world's greatest destroyer was also the world's greatest builder. The man who had emptied the world's cities was now presiding over the most opulent and brilliant court on earth. The man of blood was also the man of art. And as Clavijo looked around him at the soaring minarets, the unearthly blue tiles, the silk pavilions, and the piles of gold, he knew, with a chill, that he was looking at the plundered treasures of Delhi, the stolen genius of Damascus, and the ransomed gold of the Ottoman Empire. This was not a capital city. It was the world's most beautiful crime scene. It was a paradise built on a foundation of bones. Timur, in 1404, was presiding over his paradise of stolen talent. His court in Samarkand was the wonder of the world, receiving humbled embassies from the Mamluks in Egypt, the Ottomans in Anatolia, and the kings of Christian Europe. He had defeated every rival. He had crushed every power. He was 68 years old, an old man by any standard of the age, his body broken by a lifetime of war. His lame leg was a constant, throbbing pain. His crippled arm was useless. He was, by all logic, finished. His great game was won. But the mind of the chessmaster was not at peace. A man who lives for the game does not know how to stop. When he looked at his vast mental map of the world, one final, massive, unconquered piece remained. It was the throne of the world itself. It was the ancient, wealthy, and seemingly invincible empire of Ming China. This was not a new idea. It was the one great, unfulfilled obsession of his entire life. The motives were twofold, and both were deeply personal, rooted in his dual identity as a Mongol successor and a lord of the age. The first motive was a matter of legacy. Timur did not see himself as just Timur. He was the restorer of the great Mongol empire of Genghis Khan. He had consolidated the Chagatai Khanate, his homeland. He had crushed the Ilkhanate in Persia. He had annihilated the Golden Horde in the north. But the fourth and greatest of the Mongol successor states, the Yuan dynasty of China, ruled by the descendants of Kublai Khan, had been lost. In 1368, a native Chinese rebellion had overthrown the Mongols and established a new national dynasty, the Ming. In Timur's mind, this was a stain. It was an unrecovered piece of his inheritance. To be the true, new Genghis Khan, he had to reclaim China. It was his sacred, historic duty. The second motive was a matter of pure, colossal ego. The new Ming emperor, the Yongle emperor, was, like Timur, a man of immense ambition. He, too, saw himself as the center of the universe, the son of heaven. And in the War of Letters, the Ming court had made a fatal mistake. They had sent embassies to Timur, not as an equal, but as a subordinate. Their letters were addressed to him as a vassal, a tributary prince, who owed loyalty to the Dragon Throne in Beijing. To Timur, the man who had just broken the Ottoman Sultan for a similar, though lesser, insult, this was intolerable. There could not be two masters of the world. One of them had to bow. And Timur was not built to bow. He would not just conquer China. He would march to Beijing, overthrow the Ming, and put a Genghis-ID puppet back on the throne, proving once and for all who the true lord of the age was. This was not to be a raid, like his invasion of India. This was to be his magnum opus, his final, greatest conquest. He began to prepare. He gathered the largest army he had ever assembled. This was a national army, drawn from every corner of his vast empire. His veterans from the wars in Anatolia and Persia were summoned. His Turco-Mongol cavalry formed the core. Estimates placed the final number at an almost unbelievable 200,000 men, a river of steel that would flow east. He began to gather supplies for a campaign that he knew would last for years. It was the ultimate logistical challenge, a war at the very end of the world. But there was one opponent that Timur, the chessmaster, could not outmaneuver: time. He was 68. He was old, and he knew it. And this, for the first time in his life, made him impatient. His emirs, His sons, and his grandsons all begged him to wait. It was the autumn of 1404. A brutal winter was already descending on the steppes. To march now was madness. The rational move, the chess move, was to wait for spring. Wait for the grass to grow, to feed the million horses of his army. But Timur, in his final act, acted not with the cold logic of a chess master, but with the hot-blooded impatience of a man who fears his own mortality. He felt he did not have another spring. He would not wait. He gave the order to march. In the dead of winter, late 1404, the largest army of the medieval world set out from Samarkand. It was a dark and terrible procession. They were marching east, into the vast, empty, frozen wasteland of the Kazakh steppe. The winter of 1404 to 1405 was not just a normal winter. It was one of the most severe and brutal in living memory. The army was a dark column against a world of white. A blizzard screamed around them. The wind was so cold it cut through their felt and furs, freezing the breath in their throats. Men began to fall from their saddles. Their limbs blackened with frostbite. Horses, the lifeblood of the army, collapsed by the thousands, frozen solid in the snow. But the army did not stop. It was dragged forward by one single inhuman will. At the front of the column, bundled in furs, his lame body racked with a cough, rode the old man Timur. He was sick. He was dying. But he was forcing his entire nation to march with him, into the storm, toward his final impossible dream. The march into the winter storm was not a campaign. It was a death crawl. The 200,000 men, the greatest army Timur had ever assembled, were fighting a battle not against an enemy, but against the planet itself. The wind was a physical blade. The snow was a suffocating shroud. Horses, the lifeblood of his army, stiffened and died in the tens of thousands. Men, huddled in their saddles, simply froze to death, becoming silent, ice-covered statues. The army was held together by one single burning ember, the will of the old man at its front. Timur, racked with a deep chest-tearing cough, his lame leg a block of agony in the cold, refused to stop. In late January 1405, the ravaged column finally staggered into the frontier city of Otrar, on the banks of the frozen seared Darya River. This was the last outpost of his empire before the true uncharted void that led to China. Even Timur's inhuman will had to bend. The storm was too great. He gave the order to halt, to make camp, to wait for the worst of the blizzards to pass. But the cold had already done its work. The iron will had pushed the mortal body past its final limit. Once he was inside the walls of the governor's palace, out of the wind, the fire of his ambition that had kept him alive finally faltered. He collapsed. He was taken with a violent, shaking fever. His cough worsened. His breath became shallow and ragged. It was clear to his personal physicians and to his closest emirs that this was not a passing sickness. It was pneumonia, and it was a death sentence. The chess master, the man who had always been 20 moves ahead of the entire world, was now in a game he could not win. He was trapped. He was checkmated by his own body. For several days, he lay in the fortress at Otrar, fading in and out of consciousness. The most powerful man on earth was now a frail old man, gasping for air in a dark room, hundreds of miles from his capital. But his mind, in its moments of clarity, was still the mind of the emir. He knew he was dying, and he had one last move to play. He summoned his emirs, his generals, and the family members who had accompanied him. They gathered around his bed, these terrifying warlords who had leveled cities at his command, and they wept. They were not just losing their master, they were losing their god. Their entire world, their power, their safety, was held together by the breathing of this one dying man. Timur, with what was left of his strength, made them swear a final sacred oath. This was his last command. his attempt to control the world even from his grave. He was a supreme realist. He knew his sons Miran Shah and Shah Rukh were not like him. He saw them as weak or unstable or too artistic. His designated heir had always been his grandson, Muhammad Sultan, a man he had personally trained to be his successor. But Muhammad Sultan had died 2 years earlier, a loss that had broken Timur's heart. So now, on his deathbed, he made a fateful decision. He bypassed his living sons. He named another grandson, Pir Muhammad, the son of his deceased eldest son Jahangir, as his sole heir. He made every emir in that room, the most powerful men in the army, swear on the Quran that they would uphold the succession, that they would remain united, that they would obey Pir Muhammad as they had obeyed him. They swore the oath, their faces wet with tears. And in that moment Timur, the great pragmatist, may have been the only one in the room who knew it was a lie. He knew these men. He knew they were wolves, held in check only by his own greater power. The moment he was gone, they would tear his heir and his empire to pieces. But it was the last move he had. On the night of February 18, 1405, in a frontier fortress in the middle of a frozen wasteland, the end came. The heart that had redesigned the map of the world, that had held the lives of 17 million people in its grasp, stopped. Timur the Lame, the Iron Emir, the Scourge of God, the Lord of the Age, was dead. He had died not in a glorious battle at the gates of Beijing, not from a hero's sword, but from a common fever in his bed, defeated by the weather. A primal, paralyzing terror gripped the emirs. Their world was over. But their immediate problem was one of pure logistical fear. They were in a frontier town, surrounded by the largest, most volatile, and now masterless army on earth. If those 200,000 men, who had been held together only by their godlike fear of Timur, were to learn that their god was dead, the result would be unimaginable. The army would not just disband, it would shatter. It would explode into a civil war of all against all, right there on the frozen steppe. Every general would try to seize the army for himself. The death had to be hidden. It was the ultimate state secret. His emirs, led by his most trusted generals, made a plan. They told the army that the emir was gravely ill, and that the campaign was postponed by his orders. They secretly summoned his chief wife, Saray Mulk Khanum, to his side to make the scene look normal. Then, they had his body secretly embalmed. They placed it in a simple wooden coffin, disguised, according to legend, as a holy relic, or the body of a minor emir being sent home for burial. A small, elite detachment, in the dead of night, slipped out of Otrar. They began the long, secret, desperate funeral march back to Samarkand, carrying the corpse of the master of the world. The Great China Campaign, his magnum opus, the final crowning achievement of his life, was over. It had died with him in a snowdrift on the frozen banks of the Sir Daria. The greatest army ever assembled, with no master and no purpose, simply turned around and began its long, hungry, and chaotic march home. The dream was over. The secret of Timur's death, guarded so fiercely by his emirs, did not hold. It could not. The moment the disguised funeral procession reached the outskirts of Samarkand, the truth leaked out. A shudder of terror and uncertainty ran through the empire. The God King was dead, and the reaction was immediate. The empire that Timur had spent 35 years building with iron and blood, that colossal structure that stretched from India to the Mediterranean, had been held together by one thing and one thing only: his own personal terrifying will. And the instant that will was extinguished, the entire edifice collapsed. The sacred oath his emirs had sworn on the Quran, to protect his chosen heir, Pir Muhammad, was forgotten before Timur's body was even laid in its tomb. It was a meaningless gesture, a lie told to a dying man. Pir Muhammad was far away, weak, and had no control over the central army. The real power was with the generals and the other princes. And they did what Timur himself had taught them to do. They vied for power. The massive China army, now masterless, dissolved into warring factions, each general claiming a piece of it, each prince trying to seize the throne. The wolves that Timur had kept on a leash were now free, and they tore his empire to pieces in a savage decade-long civil war. His sons and grandsons, Miran Shah, Shah Rukh, Khalil Sultan, all waged war on each other. The empire, which had seemed so permanent, so monolithic, proved to be a magnificent hollow shell. Timur had built nothing that could outlast him. But this is not the end of his story. It is the beginning of his true and most paradoxical legacy. His political empire was dead, but his cultural empire was just about to be born. The seeds that Timur the Destroyer had so brutally planted were now, in the soil of his ruined state, about to bloom. All those thousands of captive artisans, the architects from Delhi, the painters from Shiraz, the scholars from Baghdad, were still in Samarkand and the other great cities. Their chains were broken by the chaos, but they had nowhere to go. They were a critical mass of talent, the greatest concentration of artistic genius on the planet. And they began to work for Timur's children. The victor of the bloody civil war was not a conqueror, but a peacemaker. It was Timur's youngest son, Shah Rukh. He was the anti-Timur. He was a pious, gentle, and scholarly man who hated the violence of his father's world. He rejected the brutal Mongol Yasa and ruled by Islamic Sharia. He made his capital not in the warlike Samarkand, but in the Persian city of Herat, and he turned it into the new artistic capital of the world, the Florence of the East. But the true miracle was Timur's grandson, Ulugh, the ultimate warrior, the man who saw the world as a chessboard of conquest, had produced a grandson who saw the world in the stars. Ulugh, who ruled Samarkand, was not a general. He was a scientist. He was an astronomer, a mathematician, a scientist king, who was centuries ahead of his time. He used the vast wealth his grandfather had plundered, not to raise new armies, but to build a new kind of monument. He built the Great Ulugh Observatory, a 3-story marble-clad institute that was, in essence, the most advanced university for astronomy in the medieval world. Its centerpiece was a colossal 60-degree marble sextant, a Fakhri sextant, set in a trench dug deep into the earth, designed to measure the movement of the stars with unparalleled precision. His team of scholars, using this great instrument, created the Zij-i-Sultani, a star chart that mapped the positions of 994 stars with an accuracy that was not surpassed in the Western world for another 200 years, until the invention of the telescope. The blood of the destroyer had, in a single generation, been transmuted into the ink of the scholar. This was the Timurid Renaissance. And the line did not end there. 100 years later, a young, dispossessed prince, a direct great-great-great-grandson of Timur named Babur, was driven out of Samarkand. He went south to India, the land his ancestor had plundered, and he founded the Mughal Empire. The architectural glory of that empire, the peerless beauty of the Taj Mahal, is a direct artistic descendant of the turquoise domes Timur had built in Samarkand. But the story of Timur has one final, chilling epilogue. For 5 centuries, his body lay undisturbed in his magnificent tomb, the Guri Emir, in Samarkand. Over his green jade casket, a warning was inscribed: "Whomsoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." In June 1941, a team of Soviet archaeologists, led by Mikhail Gerasimov, arrived in Samarkand. Joseph Stalin had ordered the tomb to be opened, to confirm the legends of the Iron Lame. The local elders and religious leaders begged the team not to, repeating the ancient curse. The Soviet scientists, men of materialism, laughed. On the night of June 20th or 21st, 1941, they prized open the heavy casket. Inside, they found the skeleton of a tall, powerful man, with a crippled right leg and a withered right arm. The legends were all true. 2 days later, on June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. The largest, most brutal, and most terrible land invasion in all of human history was unleashed upon the Soviet Union. The invader more terrible than Timur had been released. The story goes that Stalin himself, deeply unnerved by the coincidence, finally relented. In late 1942, as the apocalyptic Battle of Stalingrad raged, he ordered the remains of Timur to be flown to the front lines. The bones were then returned to Samarkand and reinterred with full, formal Islamic rites. Shortly thereafter, the tide of the battle and the war began to turn.